Welcome to this hearing of the Budget and Finance Committee for Monday, September 9th, 2013. I'm Paul Krikorian, Chair of the committee, and I'm joined by the Honorable Mike Bonin. Mr. Blumenfield will be here momentarily. I'd like to first open up general public comment. If there's anybody that would like to offer general public comment, I haven't received any cards yet. But if you do wish to offer general public comment, please raise your hand so I know that you are filling out your card. Seeing none, general public comment is closed. We have 3 closed session items. I'm sorry. Was there somebody raising their hand for public comment? I didn't see it. We're good? Okay. So there's 3 closed session items. We're going to be taking those up first, and you don't need to get up. We'll retire to the other room and proceed with those. But before we go into closed session, does anyone wish to offer comment on agenda items 1, 2, or 3, the closed session items? Seeing none and having received no cards, comment on those agenda items is closed, and Mr. Bonin and I will retire to closed session. Session, and for the record, Mr. Blumenfield was participating throughout closed session as well and is here with us now. Members, I'd like to propose items 10, 11, and 12 as potential consent candidates unless there are any questions or concerns. I'm okay with that. All right, and seeing none, those items are approved on consent. That brings us to item number 4.
Item number 4 is the City Administrative Officer report relative to issuing up to $81 million of taxable commercial paper notes to redeem the parking system revenue bond Series 1999A and Series 2003A.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. As Ben Hato from the CAO office, as Ben mentioned, the CAO recommends to issue up to $81 million of taxable commercial paper to redeem the parking system revenue bonds for 2 reasons. One, for interest savings, and the second one is to remove the tax restrictions tied to these bonds so that the city can move forward on 2 of its parking proposals. Current interest rates right now for short-term rates are extremely low, still at its historic lows of 0.11 to 0.15%. If we redeem these bonds using taxable commercial paper, we will save approximately $3.2 million this fiscal year. Over the life of the bonds, we estimate that we'll save approximately $802,000 each year for the next 15 years.
Okay.
Any questions?
What's the principal motivation of doing this?
The principal motivation was because of the 2 parking proposals. These 2 parking proposals have private use issues involved, which the current bonds are currently tax exempt, and we would not be able to move forward with those proposals unless these bonds were redeemed.
And whether or not those proposals were to advance, is there a fiscal advantage in proceeding with this?
Yes, we will save, like I mentioned earlier, $3.2 million this fiscal year on interest and $802,000 every year for the next 15 years.
Even with status quo in terms of the operation and management of the facilities?
Correct.
Okay. So the report says that the new commercial paper would be an obligation of the general fund, but the debt service would be paid from special funds?
Correct.
From the SPRF, I guess. How does that work? That's kind of a dual situation. Are there other situations like this, and what's the reason for that?
Yes, currently During the budget process, the Capital Finance Administration Fund, which is basically the fund that we use to pay the MICLA debt service. So currently, we have financed certain parking garages with MICLA, and SPRF pays that debt service by transferring money from SPRF to Cap Finance. So we are currently doing that right now with like the IESO parking and Vine Street parking garages. So it wouldn't be different from that structure.
So does this refinancing, if you will, does this transaction modify in any way the SPRF restrictions?
The restrictions will be lifted from SPRF regarding these bonds itself.
Okay. Well, and so what, talk that through. What does that result in terms of the flexibility of that fund? How does it change it?
Technically, the SPRF fund will not be obligated to pay for the commercial paper debt. It'll be a general fund obligation. But we recommend that we continue to use SPRF to pay down the commercial paper since it's related to the parking bonds. However, I do know there are certain restrictions to the SPRF regarding other bonds. So SPRF could not be fully a general fund.
Natalie Brill, CAO. There are two projects that the council is working on right now. The first one has to do with the MTA using the mangrove property. And in order for the MTA to use that property, because they're bond restricted, they would have to take over the responsibility of making sure that all the bond requirements are met. So we talked to bond counsel, and bond counsel said that's going to be very onerous on the MTA. I mean, they're going to take over your bond restrictions. The best way of doing that is getting rid of the bonds. If you really want MTA to use your property and to lease the property and to be able to use it whichever way they want to, then you really need to redeem the bonds. The second program that you've been working on and the Department of Transportation has been working on is to the parking lots that are currently bond funded to be able to give incentives to a parking operator to manage those facilities. You can't do that if there's tax-exempt bonds on them. So we've come to a place within the city that we're looking at different uses of our property, and the bonds themselves are not allowing us to do what you have asked us to do in the budget. So in order to accomplish that, we have to refund the bonds to be able to do that because of these tax-exempt restrictions. I mean, this is very rare for us to have to do this, but you know, we've changed our minds on what we want to do. So because of that, we have to redeem the bonds.
Changed our minds in what respect?
And, you know, when we first did the parking bonds in 98 and 2003, we had a path that we were following, that mangrove was going to be used for parking, and, you know, instead half the property is now being used for the GO bond program, and now this other half is going to be used for, you know, the MTA and eventually some type of development project, right, that it fell through a few years ago, but eventually that property would have been developed somehow, you know, by RFP, and eventually would have to redeem the bonds in order to do that type of private development. And as, you know, the city has also moved into looking at private operators to optimize our parking lots. So, you know, and that's what DOT's RFP was about, to be able to go out and look at the parking lots and do some type of commercial development within those parking lots to optimize our revenue. So in order to do that, we can't have tax-exempt bonds on it because that's a private use. You know, one of the things that we've talked about in Hollywood Highland is, you know, putting up little kiosks or some type of advertising within those properties, but we can't do that because of the tax-exempt bonds. So, you know, the question becomes, we would have to redeem those bonds. because
So
federal
you're
law.
not just talking about P3 operation of the lots.
No, I'm
Any
not talking about that.
Any commercial utilization of those lots at all is frustrated by the existence of the
Correct.
tax-exempt nature.
For example, on Figueroa Plaza that we bought a few years ago, that's 75% tax-exempt bonds and 25% taxable bonds because we leased the space to someone else, right? So that it's the same concept that you're using the property not just for governmental use, but you're also using it for something else.
So it's safe to say, it's correct to say, that doing this saves money under the status quo, but
Correct.
it also creates greater flexibility for some additional commercial use. It doesn't imply, or it's not motivated by the need to move to a P3 model in the operation of the lots.
No,
Okay.
it's not at all.
That makes a lot of sense to me in terms of the flexibility that you're getting. What I'm having trouble getting my head around is the financial mechanism, in the sense that usually you would assume a tax-exempt bond is going to get you a better interest rate than your commercial paper. And here, what you're telling me is that your commercial paper is getting you is saving you money, and that makes sense in the short run because the cost of money is so low right now. So I get that if it was just sort of paying off this year's amount, but you were also saying it saves it over the life of the bond, and in order to do that, you've got to make certain assumptions about what the commercial paper is going to cost you, the short-term loan is going to cost you over the long-term time frame. And intuitively, you would think that that would be much more expensive than a tax-exempt bond. But you're telling me that it's not. We're actually saving money. And maybe it's the time horizon I'm not understanding, or maybe it's the interest rates. But if you could help me understand the different rates and how that works, because it's
So our debt
intuitively
service
doesn't work.
analysis assumed, we looked at the 20-year history of short-term interest rates, and we took an average of that. So our calculation for debt service is based on that average. So we incorporated.
So you're using the previous 20-year history for short-term interest rate and just extrapolate, or just applying that for the next 20 years?
Correct. The next 15 years.
15.
Also, half the bonds will be paid off. When the MTA deal is finally settled and comes to you, the proposition was that half the commercial paper that we're borrowing, I think 22 million, would be paid off right away.
The 2013-14 budget includes the 22.3 million of the MTA proceeds to be applied towards the commercial paper debt.
I'm sorry, say that again.
If I could provide some information, Maria Cardenas with the CAO's office, also with the Municipal Facilities Group. The CLA and CAO and the Mayor's office have been working on a lease and sale of a small portion of property of the mangrove site to the MTA. And we are having this item in council. It's been continued until we negotiate the final deal terms. It calls for a $22.3 million lump sum payment, and that amount would be used to defease portion of the bonds that would be taken out. So that's probably why in the long run we have the savings there.
Okay, so the savings is not because of the interest rates. The savings.
It's a
is-
combination of the low interest rates.
How would it look
plus-
if you segmented it? If you took the great. So we're selling off this land. We're getting this big chunk of money. We're going to pay off a portion of the bond rates. Now, what's the delta now? If you say, okay, for the remaining of those long-term interest, those tax-exempt bonds, to do an apples-to-apples comparison, you'd have to look at what remains of the long-term bonds versus what it would cost to do it with short-term paper for 1 year and extrapolate that over the 15 years. If you were to have you done that comparison?
Yes, that's the comparison we did with the existing debt service schedule, and we compared it to our new debt service schedule based on the interest rates, the 20-year average that we took, and the remaining outstanding balance after we make the payment through with the MTA proceeds. And the savings that I quoted reflects that comparison.
The reason we took,
What's baked in is the 22.3 million
Correct.
that you've already. I'm just not saying it's not a good deal. I'm just trying to understand it. If you don't, that's great. You get the 22.3 million. Put that aside. Now the only comparison should be sort of the marginal
59.
impact. And you're telling me that the savings is based on the entirety of the sale and the difference in interest rate. What I'm curious about is what is the difference between paying off the remainder versus with short-term paper versus the long-term tax-exempt bond?
That is the analysis.
Right.
Because we looked at when the 22.3 million would come in, and we took that into consideration, and then when that would be paid off, and then we looked at the remaining 59 million that was left, and what the savings of that would be. And the reason we did a 20-year analysis is because the last 5 years have been not a good place to compare because they've been extraordinarily low. But if you look at the 15 years previous to that, and you combine the two, you get an interest rate in the taxable market that is fairly low. And when you look forward and you look at where interest rates are going, the taxable rates for the next X amount of years is comparable to the tax exempt rate. The lines have really come together because treasuries are so low. So that's part of the analysis that we did. Now, we monitor that commercial paper almost daily to see what the interest rates were. If we see, so for any of the 189 million that's currently outstanding, and even on the taxable side, if we see rates are spiking or rates are going up, we refund into long-term debt. The problem right now with long-term debt is that the long-term rates are what's going up, not the short-term. So we took that also into consideration when we looked at this during the budget, and again, we reanalyzed it when we did the report.
Do you know offhand what would the long-term rate versus the short-term rate? What those rates were?
Well, I know the long-term rate is over 5%. I think it was 5.16 or something on the 30-year, and a little bit short. It's in the 4.9 for 25-year. Commercial paper, we just rolled 11 million of commercial tax exempt at 6 basis points, 0.06%. And the taxable rate is
Just slightly, a few basis points higher.
higher than that. It's like at a 0.1, 10 basis points.
Refinance everything.
So, and that's what we've been trying to do. If you look at what we've been doing over the last 4 years, we did, 5 or 6 wastewaters, we did a few MICLAs, we did solid waste. We've been refunding our entire portfolio as much as we could.
Right.
And a lot of things we've been doing, that's what the commercial paper program is for. We increased it from 300 million to 335 to take advantage of low rates. And as rates go up, we'll refund them out into long-term debt.
I also want to, you asked why don't we do it for all the debt. Mikla Commercial Paper Program, there's a capacity issue. Like Natalie mentioned, there's only up to 335 million that we can issue. So we have to be careful of which projects we approve and which refinancing we do. And this parking refinancing is ideal because of the 2 parking proposals that were brought forward.
Mr. Bonin?
Just really one question. You've made the argument quite clear about why this is a good thing to do. What's the counter argument? What's the downside to it?
If we don't redeem these parking bonds, we will have a lot of difficulty moving forward with the 2 parking proposals. For example, MTA would have.
No, but
to
that's the
assume-
downside to not doing it.
Right,
Is there any downside to doing this?
Well, you're using capacity, right?
Right.
You
would tie up about 80 million of Mikla commercial paper capacity, and so you won't have capacity for other projects you may want to approve.
And
There's risk, there's interest rate risk, there's always interest rate risk.
Right. What might that capacity otherwise be used for?
In other words,
Improvement
put
of
it
a
into
public building,
context
equipment.
As a matter of volume. Put it into a context of, what's out there and what that $80 million represents as a portion of it, rather than examples of what we can spend it on.
Out of 330, it's what, 5th, 6th? about a fifth of the commercial paper program. About that. Right now, we have 189 million in general fund projects outstanding. That's everything that over the last couple of years that we've bought, equipment, buildings, yards. So the 80 million is about a fifth of that. We'd add 80 million to the commercial paper program. So
Yeah.
out of 335.
In following up on your question, is there a percentage, or is over 20% of this, where you'd start getting worried that we're using up too much of our capacity?
We've gone all the way up to to the limit and then refunded it out. I mean, the whole point of commercial paper is during construction, right? You use your commercial paper or until you actually purchase, because there's a lot of lead time between the time you order city equipment, I call them the Tonka toys, the big equipment, and the time you actually get it, there could be 2 years. So instead of tying up your cash, you issue a purchase order against your commercial paper, and then at the time that you actually pay for it, you issue the paper. So you save yourselves that 2 years of interest that you would otherwise have to pay. So that's what your commercial paper is for. And that's what we use it for. We use it to provide us that construction money or that order period money for the big Tonka toy equipments that we buy.
Okay. Anything further?
No, I'm glad she started talking about Tonka toys and started using terms of art that I understood. Thank you.
Well, I don't know what else to call them, those big dump trucks, term of art,
All right, we have one card on this from Dr. Molly Rhodes. Dr. Rhodes?
Hello, Council. So I'm a research analyst with SEIU 721, and this issue came to my attention because the 4-page staff report that you have, the second paragraph is entirely about the parking garages. Those of you on the Transportation Committee are well aware that the privatization of these parking garages is still controversial. Mr. Krikorian, you asked for hard numbers to come back to that committee, which I assume will be happening. And additionally, there's a personnel issue in complying with our MOU if those are privatized because there was no transition plan prepared with that RFP. We've heard nothing about a transition plan, and we're well into that 30-day report back period. I understand the person from the CAO's office who is handling that issue has moved to DWP. So I don't know if that's where the delay is or what, but I don't understand why you would move forward with a recommendation to defease the parking section of this when there has not been a clear argument complying with the city charter and our MOU presented for the privatization. And additionally, that privatization in the Bavan is closed out in 2011. So there's a lot of stuff still with that parking to be dealt with.
And just to be clear, that's why I asked the question. Because
yeah, I figured it was.
The specific issue that we're dealing with now to reduce the cost of this obligation and to increase flexibility is supportable independent of the future potential operation plan. So this is not defensible only as a basis for privatization of the lots. It's for any sort of commercial use, or even without it, it still saves money. That's what I understand staff to be telling us today.
I appreciate all of you very smart gentlemen teased that out of the report. It's certainly not evident to me in the 4 pages that was presented.
Okay. Anything else?
No.
I cut into your time, so thank you.
No, okay.
All right, thank you. Just to be clear, though, because the staff report, the CAO report does say in the second paragraph, it refers to proposals received by DOT relating to the operations of the 24 parking facilities. At first glance, that just appeared to be P3 to me, but I assume that means all commercial kinds of proposals, including the guy in my district that wants to, put a nursery business in one of our parking structures. And there's other kinds of proposals like that that don't have to do with P3 operation of the parking structures, but could be, a vending operation or any one of a number of other things within the parking structure. Is that
Correct.
right?
And what we're referring to here is Department of Transportation's RFP that went out, not for a P3, but to run the parking lots.
Okay.
And in order to do that, for them to have enough revenue, for the city to increase revenue, do the revenue sharing that the RFP talked about, in order to do that, to even share the revenue, we'd have to refund the bond. So whether it's placing ads inside or using it for another use, you'd have to redeem the debt
Right.
by IRS rules.
Okay. Very good. Thank you. If there's nothing further, members, all right. We need to act on that, or we just action required on that?
Yes. There are two recommendations.
Oh, yeah. Okay. All right. So it'll be the action of the committee without objection, members, to approve the CLA's recommendations. And thank you for that report. All right. That brings us to item number 5.
Item number 5 is the City Administrative Officer report relative to the reappropriation of reverted funds to the 2012-13 Capital Improvement Expenditure Program.
Good afternoon. My name is Alma Gibson with the CAO's office, and as Ben has indicated, our office is transmitting to you the annual Capital Improvement Expenditure Program Reappropriation Report. Just so you know, at the end of each fiscal year, all of the CIEP project accounts uncommitted balances revert to the unallocated balance within the special fund from which they were appropriated. This is primarily done in order to re-examine the need to continue to have funds appropriated for these CIEP projects. In May of this year, our office instructed the city departments to submit their request for the need to reappropriate funds that are still required to continue to fund active projects. The departments were instructed to review all project account balances, identify amounts for reappropriation and/or for reversion using the criteria established in Attachment B of our report. In addition, departments were instructed to provide justification for why the reappropriation was still needed. If funds were no longer needed, then they were recommended for reversion, which could then be used to fund the next year's appropriations and/or be recommended for reprogramming. Funds are not recommended for reappropriation when the projects have been completed and all the outstanding invoices have been paid. There had been no project activity for the last 3 years, and the remaining appropriations exceed the project needs. That's the criteria that's used to recommend reverting the monies from the projects. Our office has reviewed each of the department's submittals, and via this report, we are recommending the reappropriation of approximately $118.2 million in project funds, in project CIEP funds, I should say, as listed in column E of table 1 of our report. And we're recommending a total of $49 million of reversions, as also highlighted in table 1. And to summarize the attachments, table 1, again, provides a summary of the total CIEP reversion and reappropriation amounts, and attachment A provides a detailed breakdown of the reverted amounts that are listed in column D of table 1 by project funding and funding source. And I would like to point out that I had to introduce a revised attachment A to include one of the reversion amounts that were recommended from the local transportation fund. And so hopefully you have that. So I'd like to put that in the file. And then finally, I just would like to open it up for any questions you may have, and I do have representatives here who may be able to speak on specific CIEP projects if you need. So again, this is an annual reporting of all our CIEP fund balances.
Members? Mr. Blumenfeld? Okay, I have nothing. Thank you very much. So, members, if there's no objection, it will be the action of the committee to approve the CAO's recommendations, and thank you for the revised attachment.
Thank you.
as well.
Okay.
That brings us to item 6.
Item 6 is Los Angeles Housing and Community Investment Department reports relative to approval of the establishment of a rent escrow account program, rehabilitation loan pilot program to assist landlords to make necessary repairs to their properties in REAP. On August 28th, the Housing Committee recommended approval of the recommendations in the department's report dated August 22nd.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, council members. Roya Babazadeh, Director of Compliance Division. Rent Escrow Account Program, REAP, is a successful enforcement program that was designed to encourage property owners that they have properties with persistent housing code violations to remove the violations and maintain their properties. This program is very successful. Over 30,000 rental units are brought into a safe and habitable condition through enforcement of REAP, while other programs fail to do so. We analyzed the properties that are staying in REAP for more than 1 year, and based on Councilmember Wesson's motion, we developed this pilot program to provide small-scale property owners, known as mom and pop, with access to the capital to be able to remove the violations in their property, bring them into a habitable standard, remove the property from REAP, restore their rental income to 100%, and maintain their property. The pilot program is designed to do so with certain requirements. The property owners should be mom and pop property owners. We define it for this program as property owners that have 6 or less number of units, reside in one of the units, and these units can be in 1 or 2 parcels. Property should be subject to RSO and have been in REAP for over 1 year. The income of the property owner should be limited at or below 120% AMI, and property owners should have tried to secure a commercial loan to do the work, but they were rejected either because of substandard condition of the property or negative equity in their properties. The funding for each property is $10,000 per unit and maximum of $50,000 per property. The funding for the loan is conditioned that this money only is going to be used for removal of the housing code violations cited by HCID inspectors and citations by LA County's health department. And the loan, another condition is that after the work is completed within 6 months, maximum of 6 months, the property should be removed from REAP, and the department monitor the condition of the property 5 years to make sure that it's well maintained and it's not going to be referred back to REAP. The loan is a 3% simple annual interest, and the payment is deferred to 15 years term of the loan, or at the time that the property is sold or refinanced or transferred the title. We developed and designed this program with collaboration with landlord organizations, AGLA, CAA, and minority-owned property associations, apartment associations. They are supporting this program, and the funding that we identified for this program is removed through the amendment to the transmittal. At this point, we don't have funding for this program. Our recommendation to the committee is to approve the structure design of the program and also instruct the department to work with council officers and CAO to identify appropriate funding to start this pilot program. The pilot program targets approximately 20 properties, and the program should be completed within 18 months. We are going to come back to the council report in 24 months on the status and success of the program, and if there is a need for permanent program, recommendation is going to be made at that time. The funding that we are requesting is $1 million for the pilot program that approximately serves 20 properties, and $100,000 for administration of the program. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Okay, so the report indicates that there's about 200 properties that are potentially eligible for the program, and I
Correct.
assume that potential eligibility is based on the size of the property, whether or not it's RSO, and how long they've been on REAP, but you don't necessarily know of those 200 how many have the have met the financial conditions and have failed to receive funding from other sources and all those other requirements that you indicated, right? So that universe would shrink down, I assume, somewhat from that.
We identified 355 properties that property owners own 6 or less number of units.
Okay.
But as you mentioned, we don't have information about the income of the property owner or if they they qualify for other requirements. Our educated assessment is that 200 of them possibly qualify based on requirement of this program.
Okay. Well, I think, as a general matter, it sounds like a terrific way to help some of these smaller buildings come into compliance. It sounds like it's good for tenants, good for landlords, good for investment in improving properties that need improving. The only question I have, I think the big question that I have, is what the funding source for that is going to be, and then how we continue to replenish it if it proves to be a successful program. But that is an issue still to be further discussed and explored with the council and with the CAO's office under your proposal.
Right. You're right on the benefit of this program to property owners, to landlords, and also investment in RSO properties and removal of the blight from the communities. We did look at different sources of funding, and the funding that would make this program successful is a source of funding that has no restriction on the rent or on the income of the tenants residing in these properties. Therefore, it limits the appropriate funding to maybe 1 or 2. We came to decision that possibly if general fund is available, that would be the best source to look at.
Well, one of the concerns, I guess, that we would have to look at moving forward too is that if it's a small property owned by someone of somewhat limited means who've already been in REAP for over a year, the repayment capability for these loans is going to be somewhat limited, and I assume there's going to be some failure rate. Would these be secured in some way by the property, or what's anticipated in terms of ensuring repayment?
The loan documents, security of the loans are going to be recorded against the property. We secure the loan and the funding that way. The payment of the property of the loan is deferred to 15 years or at the time that the property is sold. So there is no monthly payments coming to this program.
Okay, so then there's no source of funds coming from the program that are replenishing the initial funding source that's beginning the program.
It is going to be deferred to 15 years or at the time that the property is sold or refinanced or transferred title.
Okay. Mr. Blumenfield?
Yeah, so, theoretically, it's over time. You could make money on this project depending on what you set the return value. But
Right.
But it's not. All these folks have not been able to get commercial loans as well. So there's clearly some. There's another risk that we're missing here because it's a great. I like the idea of it. But in a certain sense, why aren't the commercial? If it's backed by the property, why aren't the commercial lenders doing it?
Well, when we look at some of these properties and talk to the property owners, encouraging them to go for commercial loan, the response I was getting from them is that substandard condition of the property is one issue they are facing, and banks are not willing to take the risk to give money to properties in that condition. And also, still, although the property value of the real estate have gone up, still the inventory of the properties that they have negative equity is very large. Hopefully, after a few years, as the value of the property is increasing, and this foreclosure are going to be resolved more than what it is now, banks are going to be willing to loosen the requirement and give loans more easier than what it is now.
So it's not that it's the substandard nature of it, it's that they don't think the equity is going to be there. Because it's substandard, they think it's worth less, and they don't think the equity is there, which is why they're not doing the loans? Am I mishearing that?
Substandard condition of the property maybe is a way to look at on how it reflects on the property owner as credibility. And beside the income might be impacted, because if condition of the property is substandard, there is a possibility of tenants leaving the property and rental income goes down, and ability of the property owner to pay the loan would be decreased, I'm assuming.
Isn't conceivably, and I like this approach. I mean, I like what you're doing with this, but conceivably, couldn't we basically save the money and just sort of co-sign the loan with the banks, in essence, and become somehow the big brother co-signer of it, let the banks put the money out, and move more than 20 of these projects, move a lot of these projects?
Well, one way that we looked at it was to go for warranting the loan for the bank and having revolving funds with the bank to raise their ability to loan to these properties, but still the banks are going to consider these properties risky. And also, when the bank gives out the loan, we don't have as much control over these properties to make sure they are going to go through the process, work is going to be properly conducted, and property is removed from REAP. By providing these through loans through the department, we have more control over this process. We are setting requirement that property owners should acquire services of a licensed contractor and remove all the violations within the scope of the violations within 6 months, and remove the property from REAP within 6 months. We monitor the entire process, and if something is not properly done, the department has ability to take action. The intention is to make sure these properties are habitable and removed from REAP. And we have more control over that if we provide this funding and monitor the entire process in the department.
I'm Domingo Salcedo with the Housing Department's Code Enforcement Program. And you asked a question earlier about the bank's willingness to loan money to some of these buildings. Well, when the inspectors go out there and they sign an order, they issue an order, they'll record this order in the county recorder's office. Some of the banks are reluctant in many cases to lend money to properties that have these orders issued against them. And by issuing these loans and being able to eliminate these orders or these violations on these orders, it makes the property a little bit more attractive for them to loan. And the idea is to try to get these properties out of these conditions so that we can get these buildings out of REAP and address the life safety violations in some cases, so that the people can live in more safe and clean conditions on the property.
Council members, at this time what we are requesting is to allow us to go through this process as a pilot program, experience and see how it works, and if there are going to be better way identifying the issues, identify the best practice through this pilot program, and come back to council within 24 months and make recommendation of about how we can improve this program, possibly can be done later by contractor or by revolving fund. But this pilot program gives us opportunity to go through this program with 20 properties and identify strengths and weaknesses of the program.
Council members, one of the issues that we see from the CAO is we haven't reviewed this proposal. That we haven't prepared a report relative to this proposal. So obviously, one of the questions we also have is regarding the funding, not just from an ongoing basis, but also just the pilot program itself. There hasn't been an identification of the funding that would fund the initial program. And one of the instructions actually authorizes the general manager or designee to approve loan agreements and documents with the program applicants. And that's another issue that we have is without a funding source, without knowing what's going to be there to backstop the loans, giving that authorization is an issue for us, even if this was to go forward to council, just with the establishment of the concept of the loan program.
Yeah, thanks. So the Housing Department would administer this program, right?
Correct.
What do you anticipate the costs of administering it would be for the 24-month pilot?
The cost of the administrating program is a little over $100,910.
And is that a cost that will come from the allocation you're seeking from the council, or is the department going to absorb that cost?
We designed the program in the most efficient way, and we have leveraged our resources through acquiring services of landlord organizations, existing programs that we have, but this is the most limited dollar amount we need for processing the loans for the program.
But is that limited amount? I appreciate that it's a small amount and you've leveraged. Is that going to be absorbed by the department, or is that part of the cost of?
Part of the cost of this program.
Okay, 200 potential properties, 20 that would benefit. How are you selecting the 20 out of the 200?
It's going to be first come, first serve, and I have to qualify for the requirement of the program that are set.
And the money can be used for materials or labor, or both?
The money can be used only for the removal of the violations. The property owner is required to acquire services of a licensed contractor, present the contract to the department. Department reviews the scope of the work, make sure it's in line with cited violations, and then it's going to be approved. And the only other reason that the money can be used is if the property owner owes fees to the department. That might be a reason to not to remove property from REAP. So 10% of the fee can be used to pay for the fees owed by the property owners. The remaining, if there was any money owed, the remaining is specifically just used for removal of violations. Payment are going to be paid to the contractor.
To the contractor directly, so it won't be a handyman, it'll be a certified.
It has to be certified.
And this program would be subject to compliance with the city's living wage ordinance, correct?
Yes, and every contract, yes.
Okay.
That's all I got.
Okay, well, I like the architecture of this. I remain concerned that we don't know how we're going to pay for it. I think it seems like a good investment. What I'd like to propose is that we instruct the department to work with the CAO to try to develop some options for funding for the pilot program, and then the CAO report back with the department, report back to this committee in 45 days. With potential funding sources and an analysis. Mr. Seha, do you think that works?
Yes.
Okay. And the report back on the pilot program itself, if we do advance it and if we do fund it, I think I would prefer, rather than waiting 6 months following the completion of the program. I'd like to have a report back in the middle of the program, say after the first 9 months, so that we see how we're doing. Maybe if it's instantly oversubscribed and we see that it's going famously, that might, encourage us to act more quickly on it. On the other hand, if it's not working the way we'd hoped, I'd rather not wait 2 years to find that out. So I think a quicker report back after the first 9 months would be in order. So why don't we bring it back to this committee in 45 days with funding recommendations, and we'll consider it again and move forward from there. Make sense?
Yes.
Okay. That'll be the action of the committee. Thank you. That brings us to item number 7.
Item number 7 is motion Bonin Buscaino relative to city's use of...
Oh, I'm sorry. Wait, I'm sorry. Before we move off of number 6, we did have a public comment card. I'm so sorry. Is it Dean Ebery? Dina, sorry.
I apologize. I put my notes on my phone. So, my name is Dina Eberly. I work with the Eberly Company. I'm a property manager and landlord, as well as the landlord outreach contractor for the REAP program for the housing department. And I just wanted to, give you my support in regards to this program. I think it would be absolutely amazing for these landlords. I'm the one that's on the ground. I'm the one that's meeting with them. And I see that a lot of these people, they inherited these properties. They don't have the money to make the repairs, and they're stuck. They're throwing up their hands. And if they just had the money to make the repairs, it would get them out of REAP. They'd be able to rent the units out and get full rent on the units, that support themselves, and the money will go back into the community. And I know that there was a concern about repayment of those loans. And a lot of these people, they're sitting in REAP, and it costs money to sit in REAP, and they accumulate fees that are owed to the department, along sometimes with penalties and or interest. And it's a lot more if they sit in REAP and don't get this loan than it would be for this loan. So the bad debt to the department would be larger if these fees accumulate and don't get paid than if this loan is given to them, even if it never got paid back, which it wouldn't. I see a lot that these properties, once they feel that they're out of REAP, they want to maybe look into selling or refining and pulling some money out of the value to live, and in order to do that, they'd have to repay the loan. So I think it's a win-win.
Very good. Thank you very much. So since I was late in getting public comment, without objection, I'd ask that we reconsider item number 6, and without objection, our action will be as it was before. So thank you very much. That brings us to item number 7.
Item number 7 is motion Bonin Buscaino relative to the city's use of 1911 Act improvement projects in the delivery of cost-effective infrastructure improvements, provide analysis of 1911-1913 Act improvement bond interest rates, and if warranted, make recommendations to modify the rates. On September the 4th, the Public Works and Gang Reduction Committee recommended approval of the motion.
Who's reporting on number 7?
Mr. Chair, if I could just sort of intro this a little bit, because this is sort of an odd situation. There's a number of residents of South Mar Vista who have streets, this part is not unusual, that are in very poor condition. They wanted to get their streets fixed, and they were told that essentially that they couldn't get their streets fixed because the curbs and gutters were in such poor condition that if the streets were fixed, they would deteriorate so quickly that it wasn't worth the city's investment. So the Bureau told them a few years back that the only way they could get their streets resurfaced is if they assessed themselves to upgrade the curbs and gutters. So it was some neighbors organized to get this assessment district created. It was a very tough sell, as you might imagine, because a lot of people felt, well, why the hell am I paying for my curbs and gutters so that I can get the streets done that should have been done 30 years ago, because these streets have not been done in 30 years. The folks in the neighborhood voted in favor of this assessment district, about 51 to 49%. As a result, a number of households that were not in favor of this are going to be hit with fees of $6,000, $7,000, $8,000. It turns out, and we discovered this because Mr. Lopez from the Times wrote about it, the interest rate, if you don't pay for this up front, is 9%, which, as Mr. Lopez pointed out, is ridiculously high and considerably higher than is the case for interest rates for almost anything else. And apparently it dates back to the 1911 and 1913 Improvement Act bonds. And so the point of this motion was to examine why we're using 9%, how we can start doing a cheaper rate that's more fair to residents. Please.
Good afternoon, council members. My name is Randy Price from the Bureau of Engineering. Generally, within the city, as you know, public improvements are put in through one of three ways within the city, either by the private development process with a B permit, or through a capital improvement project with city funds, or in some cases through the assessment process. And the assessment process is used for putting in public improvements in neighborhoods which are older, which of course can't use the private development process, and for which public funds are not available. And so the types of projects that this is done for are public improvements which include a full street improvement, which is typically street, curb and gutter, sidewalks, sewer, drainage system, street trees, street lights, the whole process for public improvement. The citizens in the community petition the city for a public improvement. Usually they fill out a form, they circulate it among their neighbors, and they get signatures asking for these public improvements. The Bureau of Engineering's role in this process is to help the citizens through that process. We do not advocate for or against any project. We're sort of the referee here and just help them through that process. So the things that we do are prepare the legal paperwork so that the district can be formed. We design the project and we put it out to bid and award. The interest rate, the process that we use is called the 1911 Act Assessment Improvement Process. It's governed by the state Streets and Highways Code, and typically it's a very good process for those communities which need those improvements but have no way of actually getting an improvement put in, since it takes the entire community to collaborate. Our goal in this whole process is always to be fair to both sides and go through that process and let them vote on it. As Councilman Bonin has said, the interest rate is the issue that's really at the heart of this. The interest rate is set by the City Council. We do not do very many of these projects now, and so since most of the new developments put in the streets and put in the public improvements, we do 2 or 3 of these projects a year, both in the Bureau of Engineering and the Bureau of Street Lighting. And so the interest rate for these projects has not been looked at in many, many years. I think the 9% was set in 1991. And so it is certainly time to revisit that interest rate and see what is appropriate. I spoke to the city treasurer last week about this issue, and according to them, the last 2 similar type projects that were done in which they were able to get a public bid on the interest for the bonds for the interest, they got a 5.7% bid for those particular bonds. There are some things to consider. One is that since these are assessment projects, the city doesn't really put up any money for these projects. The property owners pay for everything. So consequently, when they go out to bid to a contractor, the contractor understands that they will not get paid progress payments for their work. And so they only get paid as the property owners pay them over the life of the period that they pay back into it. And typically, it's a 10-year period. And so when they bid on those projects, they take into consideration both their resources and what they can afford to put into that project, knowing that their payback is going to be over 10 years. And so they do include the interest rate in their and when they make that bid. So, any questions?
You were
Natalie Brill,
rushing
CAO.
to come on up, so
About 10 years ago, we were asked by the Treasurer's Office to look at the street bond program. 1911 is really not used anymore by most cities in California. One of the reasons is because it is expensive, and it is basically an auction of the bonds. So you're basically at the mercy of whoever wants to buy a warrant for the city. So we actually put forward a recommendation to the Treasurer's Office that was never implemented from one of our financial advisors to make it more of a revolving fund so we'd have more control on the interest rate. So we'll work with the Treasurer's Office to come up with different ideas to see how to do this. This is like the CAO's office does the assessments when they're over like $1 million. We issued the one for Westwood, and that was, I think, like 15 or 20 years ago. But I think that there's a better mechanism, or we can maybe refund some of these and create a better program that's more in line with the lower interest rate. Because when we heard it was 9%, we were like, wow, really? Because you just heard what our rates were for commercial paper. So I think that there's a way we can study this a little bit and see what we can come up with.
And I don't want to put anybody on the spot to give an off the top of their head reaction to this, but is there any concern of, maybe there's a representative of the city attorney's office who could speak to this? Is there, I don't know if there is, but are there potential implications under Prop 218, or if you're changing the interest rate sort of midstream, does that create
You're right, we'd have to check with the city attorney,
kind
with
of
outside bond
change the
counsel.
rules after the rules had been agreed to at the creation of the beneficially, but I just wonder if that creates.
If you guys ever refunded, I don't know if one has ever been refunded or not. Has one of these districts ever been refunded?
No, not to my
Yes,
knowledge.
yeah, I don't know if they ever have or not. We'd have to go back, look at the act.
So I'd be supportive of certainly going out and having a look at it, and maybe including within the context of that report back a review of the recommendations that your office had already made that haven't been implemented. But it should also encompass, obviously, a legal review about whether or not this is legally feasible to enact. Any questions?
Well, I think there's two parts. One is the sort of looking forward at the whole program, which Natalie spoke to, which I think would be a good report back to this committee. The second is because the bids have not yet gone out for the Mar Vista Oval curb assessment. We just certified this vote last week. Is there still an opportunity to do the due diligence consultation with the city attorney's office and try to find a way to reduce this for this particular assessment?
Yes, the property owners vote on the principal assessment amount. So they do not vote on the interest rate itself. The council adopts the interest rate as a part of the assessment process when it goes through first the ordinance of intention, and then there's a later process where the assessments are confirmed at council. Prior to the assessments being confirmed, the interest rate, prior to the bids going out, the interest rate would need to be adjusted so that the contractor that bids on the project could know exactly what interest rate he would be expected to receive. And typically, for example, the Mar Vista project is expected to go out to bid in the spring sometime. So we have a matter of 4 or 5 months to look at that particular issue and come back with a recommendation that might be more appropriate. Then council would have to adopt either a motion or an amended ordinance directing that the interest rate for this particular project be changed from the 9% to some other more appropriate interest rate.
That would be great.
I think it's a good spark to a larger conversation because we have so many of these districts that are potentially impacted. It might be a good opportunity to have a look at the larger solution as well. So if there's no objections, that'll be the action.
So do we need to have a report back then on Natalie's recommendation?
Again, sorry, thank you.
And do we need to have Natalie's recommendations?
Well, I would ask that, because we're going to, the motion is calling for a CAO report back anyway, so that'll just be encompassed within the
Thank you.
context.
Thank you, Randy.
But actually, before we take the action on that item. I do have a card, one card, Mr. McQuiston, so come on up, Jim.
Jim McQuiston, as you know, Bill Robertson put me on the sidewalk task force some time ago, and since that time, I've been campaigning to get the property owners to actually pay for the improvements, because I found out that the California Supreme Court in about 1906, I think it was, said the cities cannot pay for this. You have to assess the landowners. But there's, as far as the interest rate is concerned, the Streets and Highways Code does not set the interest rate. It's up to the individuals. And actually, you know, I've got the hair to prove it. We used to be assessed. Somebody would come around and say, fix your sidewalks or we're going to do it. And we always could get somebody, a private individual, to fix the sidewalks a lot more efficiently, I'd say, than the city does, and therefore it was at a lower cost. And also that means that the city, who is required to do the streets, no one else can do the streets, can concentrate on the streets themselves. But even the streets themselves, I remember in the San Fernando Valley, everybody had dirt streets because they didn't want to pay for the paving, and that was up until the 50s. So I'm in favor of the idea of putting out the bonds. It's just exactly like when we put in streetlights. It's handled exactly the same way by the same actual Streets and Highways Code. So it's not something that the city doesn't know how to do. And I would say we have to do that. It costs us over $20 million a year not to do it. That's how much we save if we get on the stick. And besides that, then we have a beautiful city. So everybody gains from it. There's no excuse from putting it down. It's the amount of a pack of cigarettes a month. That's what it costs people to get everything fixed.
All right. Thank you, Mr. McQuiston. Okay, that brings us, so with that being said, it will be the action of the committee to approve the recommendations with the comments that we had made. That brings us to item number 8.
Item number 8 is the Joint Chief Legislative Analyst and City Administrative Officer report relative to the first status update on the functional transfer of development services programs of multiple city departments to create a new development services department. On August 27th, the Planning and Land Use Management Committee recommended to note and file this report.
Good afternoon, council members. Matthias Farfan for the Office of the CLA. Before you is the first status update on the development services functional transfer. As you know, the adopted budget has included the functional transfer of planning, development, and building and safety services into a new department, and that's supposed to become effective on January 1st, 2014. As such, the budget instructed the CLA and the CAO to work on a transition plan to make that happen. As part of that transition plan, we were also instructed to hire a consultant to assist in developing the transition plan. That has occurred already. It's Matrix Consulting was chosen by the working group. The report before you also outlines how the CLA and the CAO have structured the team to develop that transition plan. The effective departments are involved. Aside from that, we've also involved the personnel department to review HR-related issues, also the CAO's Employees Relations Division, and the city attorney is also involved. If you have any questions, staff are here to answer them.
Before we do, did anybody else want to add to that, or there's a bunch of...
Tyler Munhall with the CAO. We also have brought the consultant, Gary Golitz, so he is at the table if you have questions for him, and all the departments have representatives here.
Okay, great. Members?
Go ahead. Wanted to know in terms of the consolidation, is it expected to save the city money? How much, or you know, what's the analysis on that?
The objective is not cost savings. There won't be any layoffs as a result of the new department being created. The bottom line is to improve customer service and accountability in the development services system for the city.
Let me rephrase then the question, because I wasn't implying what we should or shouldn't, but really, has there been a cost analysis? Is there going to be, is it going to cost us more? How much? What does the department think? What does the consultant think? I mean, that's, even though that's not the riding reason for doing this, it's certainly something we should be cognizant of.
Councilmember Jason Klein from the Office of the CAO. The analysis on the actual cost of functionally integrating these two departments has not been calculated down to the one-time cost. The adopted budget reflects the operating costs for all of the functions as they currently exist. What we anticipate is, as the consultant moves forward with their organizational plan, as well as any staffing recommendations, our office, with the assistance of the CLA, will move forward with a cost plan to spell out what the costs of co-locating these functions in one location are, as well as making any modifications to the staffing plans for either of the two departments. But those will be handled in the context of the budgetary process.
So the cost of the one-time hasn't been decided or hasn't been determined yet, but is there an ongoing, there's been some cost analysis.
Part of the council action was did direct the CAO to do a fiscal analysis. So there will be the one-time costs of moving and co-locating and building out. There will also be changes to business processes that will result in us needing to do comprehensive fee studies to look at, do the fees we're currently charging continue to represent the costs of providing those services? That's going to happen. There will be phases to that, and those fee studies won't happen January 1.
Yeah, I'm still trying to get my head around when we'll know, if we don't know the costs now, when we'll know that. Are we going to know these costs, the one-time costs and the fee costs and all that, before this goes into effect? And is that, is there something to be said for knowing that before it goes into effect?
In October, you will know some of the costs. What we anticipate is the consultant has done cycle time analysis.
Is that what? I'm sorry.
Cycle time analysis. So how much time does it take for us to complete the permitting process? Who owns the permitting process at which different stage? Some of the bottlenecks in the process and some of the lags in the process are directly tied to staffing. So if the council is desirous to reduce the cycle times for those individual functions, we may need to add additional staff to actually process applications quicker. That would be something that the consultant would bring forward and say that you can reduce your cycle time by this amount if you add this additional staff. There will be a cost directly tied to that, and we could bring forward the cost analysis tied to that to say that if we want to reduce our cycle time from 6 months down to 4 months, this is how much staff we would have to add, and this is what the costs associated with that would be.
The consolidation analysis has to bring forward the cost of that particular consolidation, both in terms of ongoing costs as well as one-time costs. So
Sorry,
the answer
sir,
is...
Can you identify yourself, please?
Pardon me?
Can you identify yourself, please?
Pardon me. My name is Gary Golitz. I'm with the Matrix Consulting Group. My firm has been retained to do the analysis and develop recommendations on feasibility for the consolidation. Pardon me. The issue here is it's hard for council to make a good decision about whether consolidation does or does not make sense, because ultimately that decision is going to be back in front of council without having cost information both ongoing as well as one time. That will be part of the analysis that's brought forward to council.
Okay, and when do we get that? Because that's obviously a big part of this is a status update, but that's a big part of at least
the consultant's final report will be given to the CAO and CLA in early October. A joint CAO-CLA report will come out a few weeks after that. So we're thinking mid-October we'll have our report out to you.
And that will have the one-time costs, the cycling costs, but you're saying it won't have the fee cost, the extra fees.
We won't have completed fee studies by that point.
But you'll have some sort of ballpark range for us on what that's going to look like. I mean, I guess this is our chance to give some direction for that. Is what I want to see is a real, hard analysis of all the costs, and be able to sink my teeth into that. So
I would like to clarify. What we will be bringing within the report to CEO and CLA's office is the cost of the consolidation itself, and talking about some of the limitations that the city faces in terms of staffing as it pertains to cycle time. I don't know that we're going to be able to do a staffing analysis for every function involved in development review and identify what staffing levels you should have. I think what we should expect the consultant to do is say, if you want to consolidate these 5 particular functions in a new department, here are the particular one-time costs associated with doing that, and then here are the particular ongoing costs associated with doing that, and then discussing in further detail the process challenges that this city faces, because most of your processes, I would say, are far more convoluted and complex than necessary. And then secondly, also talking about some of the limitations that you face because your staffing right now does not match up with workload in some selected areas.
and I guess as part of that, I also want to see the cost-benefit analysis, which I assume is part of it.
The cost-benefit analysis has to focus on trying to bring your cycle times down to something which is more realistic vis-a-vis your neighbors, the Glendales, the Burbanks, the Pasadenas. Your cycle times right now, I would say, are not very good. And I don't think that's any surprise to you.
No.
So I think the issue is those cycle times cannot be solved on January 1st simply by consolidation. They will help some accountability for fixing those cycle times, but right now there's a lot of hard work left, a lot of hard work remaining even after consolidation.
And I think it's important to set expectation levels. So we're getting the report October 4th. To do, depending on what is in the report, there will be a lot of analysis back and forth between the departments and our office. We also feel a strong need to get that report to you as soon as possible. So that the policy discussion can begin. So there may be, it may end up being 2 reports where we provide you as best we can 2 weeks after we get the report, as much policy so that those questions can start being answered, followed by a more detailed fiscal analysis. We have not sort of charted out the best way of doing that, but I think we may need more time than 2 weeks to complete that analysis.
I have to say, as supportive as I am of moving forward in this direction, I remain fairly suspect that we're going to be ready by January 1st. I just don't. I mean, there's so much work still that you've described already that's going to be in these reports, let alone the additional kinds of analysis. I'm hopeful, but somewhat suspect that we're going to be. I mean, what do you think about that? Or do we remain on pace to be able to actually begin implementing on January 1st?
We are currently on pace. It is a very ambitious timeline, and that was expressed by actually all the proposers as well in interviewing them. But currently we are moving along, staying on pace. I think if anything, we're perhaps a week behind at this point, but we are meeting regularly to make sure that we do stay on pace.
Great. And just to Matrix, you've just fairly recently been retained on this, and you have a quick report back in just a few weeks. A lot of what we wanted to be done was very extensive outreach to the stakeholders, the building community, labor organizations, neighborhood councils, and many other stakeholders. Can you talk a little bit about where we are with, because there are plans that are described in the report. I'm just wondering what's the current status of that?
The peer survey of 5 to 10 other cities has been done. That product's been generated. We are still going to be talking to Dallas tomorrow, but we have contacted successfully 7 other cities, including Chicago.
Great.
We have a written document in front of the CLA and CEO's office as of this time. It's draft, but we have a draft document. We have completed stakeholder surveys, although I would say that's still a moving target from a standpoint that we're still out talking to neighborhood councils. But we've got a draft document in front of the CAO's office and CAO's office on that as well. I would say the feedback we've received varies depending upon the group you're talking about. They all have different perspectives. I would say the neighborhood councils really don't care how you organize development services. They just want good service, good timely service. And there's a lot of anxiety, I would guess I'd say, out in the development community about the potential impact of consolidation on the levels of service they receive right now and the impact on long-range planning. So I would say that depending upon who you talk to, if you talk to 200 different people, you'd probably get about 200 different opinions about what works and what doesn't work.
By the way, how were the cities selected for the peer cities review?
They were selected by the CAO and CLA's office. We are trying to look both towards the local Southern California area, such as San Diego and Glendale, as well as cities that were among the largest population in the United States, so that we are comparing large cities to large cities.
I'm sorry. One just point of correction. There's a working group of all the impacted departments, and they selected the cities, and we had the consultant do that.
Mr. Bondi.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Improved customer service, speeding up the recycling time. I've heard a lot of reasons why we're doing this. I'm, for one, not sold on the need to do this, just to be clear. The terms I don't hear when I hear people talking about this are better planning and enhanced safety. And that concerns me, because I think that should be the primary purpose of doing this. I certainly want to see the development process go faster. I think I was told the other day that about 25% of the development in the city goes on in my district or on the west side, in mine and Mr. Koretz's, so I certainly want it to move faster so I can get stuff off my plate. But I'm concerned that we're not studying enough in this process and in the scope of work that they've given you how the merger should be designed to make sure that we have better planning and that we do a better job enhancing public safety in the buildings that exist. So how much of that is a focus of the conversations you're having with the stakeholders?
It is, I would say I regard it really healthy when I'm out talking to developers and they say we need to focus more attention, effort, and money on completing and updating community plans. Because that's typically not something I hear from developers. They'd rather prefer a blank slate as much as possible. So I'm very encouraged by hearing the development community say, we need to update our community plans. I'm very encouraged by hearing the development community say, we need to update the zoning code because the current one is outdated, obsolete, provides very little direction, and what direction it does provide is very confusing. So I haven't heard anyone in the development community say, keep things vague or keep things outdated. I've heard them say, we need updated community plans, we need updated zoning code. So that is absolutely, they basically want zoning codes that reflect the 21st century and not the 20th. And basically the zoning code, as you know, was originally updated. The one we got right now was originally adopted in 1946, and we haven't done a comprehensive update since then. So I think part of what they're asking for is a updated zoning code. Council has made that commitment and committed $5 million to do that. That's a good thing. Community plans on whole, your community plans on average are about 15 years of age. We would say that a good shelf life is about 10 years. So the city as a whole has got a lot of work to do on that area. We will, of course, be addressing that because you have to balance the need for speed with the quality of the vision the city provides for its neighborhoods. So I guess we have to pay attention to life safety. You can't do anything to compromise life safety. Anything we propose is going to make sure there is that important balance between vision and life safety, between vision and the need for speed, basically. So I think that we are not going to focus just purely on process. The organizational structure we bring forward has to make sure that there's that independent structure to make sure that life safety is addressed within DBS.
Okay, that's more in the neighborhood of what I was saying. It's not exactly the same thing, but developers saying we need community plans doesn't necessarily equate to me that we're going to get better planning. I mean, there's some developers who do very good work and who really want to see good planning, and then there's some developers who just want to do what they can do. I'm curious, what have the conversations been? Tell me more about the conversations you've had with community residents, neighborhood councils.
We've had 2 meetings so far, one with the Harbor Council and the other with
the Los Angeles Neighborhood Council Alliance.
And we've got more scheduled between now and September 20th.
We're meeting with all the alliances, South, West, Harbor, Valley. We're also meeting with the Plan Check Neighborhood Council. And we have a workshop at the Congress of Neighborhoods.
Is there a meeting with neighborhood folks in each planning area? For the area covered by each APC?
The alliances cross over multiple planning areas. We have not gone to that level of detail yet.
I'd strongly recommend that you do. I think there's a difference in opinions in different parts of the city. There's different attitudes. I noticed that there's meetings with CCA and there's meetings with VICA. We've heard talks about developers. For me, the big customer is the mom and pop, the small business who's trying to open. I hear tales of woe. When you talk about speeding the process, I hear tales of woe from the small business owner, the mom and pop. In your conversations, are you talking with someone who in the past 5 years has opened a restaurant or a yoga studio or a retail business?
If they are part of the neighborhood council group, the answer is yes. If not, then there may be a particular problem with that particular group that we've chosen so far. I'd have to take a look again at the staff and the groups that we've talked to within this city.
I would guess that from my experience, I have a lot of friends who've recently opened businesses, when they're in their first 5 years, and I think that's where we'll get the most relevant feedback on how the building and safety and the plan check process goes, someone who's recently built a building or remodeled or built something out. In the first 5 years, they really don't have time to participate in neighborhood councils. So I'm wondering, is there a way you can do specific outreach to new small business owners? Because I think the feedback you'll get from them is going to be particularly relevant to what the problems are.
Council member, if you've got some folks that you think we need to talk to, we'd love to talk to them.
Oh,
Okay.
Well, I got more than you'll want, but okay.
We would appreciate any and all suggestions. If you could get those to the CAO's office, we'd of course love to talk to them.
Excellent. Thank you.
I would make the suggestion that there should be formal outreach of some kind. I think it's a really important addition to this outreach, not just to the large business organizations, but to the local community chambers of commerce, because every local community chamber of commerce has many members who have shared these stories, and they'll be the points of contact, I think, for the city to be able to generate that information.
The chambers are part of the stakeholder outreach. We're also going to have an online survey go live later this week. And the link to the survey will be provided to all of the council districts as well as the departments that participate. In this process. They're going to post the link on their websites such that all of the residents and the small business owners have an opportunity to voice their concerns and get that back to.
Yeah, but to me, it's not as balanced as a sit-down focus group with VICA. And I want to make sure that there's that same opportunity. So I'm happy to help set something up, and we'll be happy to give you some names and some stuff.
Thank you.
Mr. Blumenfield?
So what about in terms of meeting with labor and dealing with the issues that they're bringing up proactively? What kind of issues are they bringing up, and how are we dealing with them?
We've met with representatives in the employee associations and labor groups. I think part of what the anxiety they are expressing is what happens to me on January 1st. As an example, there is an electrical inspector who represented the inspection group, has said, who do I report to on January 1st? And I said, who do you report to now? And that's who you're going to report to on January 1st. The organizational structure is not going to be turned upside down such that you report to a senior city planner on January 1st. You're part of the inspection, trade, and profession. You're going to continue to be part of the inspection, trade, and profession. So I guess part of what we're hearing is a lot of anxiety about how is this going to impact me. And part of my response is this is not going to affect the line staff in any of these departments, because they're going to continue to deliver service the way they are delivering it now. It's going to affect primarily the middle and top management of the organizations, not the first-line supervisors and the line staff, basically.
So we've had 2 large working group meetings with all of the labor organizations in one room. We've also had focused meetings between Matrix, Employee Relations, the Personnel Department, and individual labor organizations. A lot of the questions to date have been focused on the implementation plan and what's going to happen and how we're going to roll that out. As that decision has not been made and that plan has not been presented, there's a lot of details that they still have questions about, and to the extent that we can address those questions in the interim between when the final reports are released and today, we're trying to address them, and the FAQ is part of the document that has come out from that. So the FAQ was built on over 400 questions that employees from the various departments have had as it relates to this process. And as the questions come in, it's a living document. We'll be making updates to that as well. Employee relations as well as the personnel department are very active in trying to meet the concerns of all of the different individuals that are impacted, especially the employees and labor organizations that are representing them.
I think there's 2 parts. One is the impact on the employees, which is very important, but it's also going to those employees who have the bird's eye view as to what's happening every day. They're an incredibly valuable resource of folks who know this process, and I just want to make sure that they're being partners in this and really listened to as this process goes.
We haven't just talked to general managers. We've gone down into the bowels of the organization to talk to first-line supervisors about how they deliver service. We are right now flow charting some of the basic processes, and the only way you can do that is to talk to people who actually execute those processes. So we're down talking to the Express Permit Center about how an express permit gets processed. We're down talking to the over-the-counter permit center about how the over-the-counter permit process gets done. We went out to the Valley to talk to BOE about how the B permit process works or in this case does not work. And so by and large, the only way you can really understand processes is by going out to talk to the people who actually execute the processes. But again, this is a 7-week time frame. There are roughly 1,100 people involved in this. We will not be able to talk to all 1,100 people in 7 weeks. So we have to make sure that we talk to essential staff at the top, middle, and lower levels of the organization. So we have talked to secretaries, we've talked to clerks, we've talked to the chief of clerks in DBS, et cetera. We do not want to just talk to general managers.
I guess one thing I'm hearing in our a lot of similar comments are saying we're in a very tight time frame. Are we going to be able to do all this? I want to make sure that if the time frame is too tight, that we hear about that so that we can give you the breathing space, Ginny, because it's better to do this right than to do it quick.
As part of the report, you're going to see recommendations about phasing and the order of things that need to occur. So timing will be discussed in the final report.
I think anyone would suggest that the 7-week time frame is ambitious. The 7-week time frame will govern our ability to get granular in terms of process improvements. We will not be able, you've got, for example, 127 clearances that an applicant could potentially have to get for a building permit at 14 or 15 different departments or state agencies. We will not have the ability to get down and get into each one of the 127 clearances and ask why that is particularly necessary. We will be able to focus on processes as a whole, including the clearance process, and suggest that we need to turn that upside down and do it on behalf of the applicant rather than the applicant having to do it on behalf of themselves. But we will not be able to get granular in a 7-week process. We're not going to be able to be do as much outreach as perhaps council would like in a 7-week process. That's just the way it is.
Okay. We have a number of cards on this, so thank you very much for that report. We're going to hear first from Richard Sanchez, followed by Michael Hunt. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Council. On behalf of the Engineers and Architects Association, my name is Richard Sanchez. I'm here representing them. I've been instructed to state that the EAA neither supports nor opposes the current proposition or proposal. The other day, Councilman Englander at the Plum Committee said that and I paraphrase, that the process is broken, and we're not going to dispute that because it is. Our concern, though, is that you can't fix something that is broken if you have not identified what is broken. And it's really nice you have a car and it stops running and you give it a nice paint job and you give it a nice wash and say, okay, it's fixed. And you try and start it and it doesn't start. And the problem is you haven't really identified what's broken. So again, you can't fix if it isn't broken. So again, we're not looking, we encourage anything that's going to improve services to the city of Los Angeles. We do. But we want it done methodically. We'd like to see it done where the problems that are going to be imposed are actually going to produce the product that you want, improvement to the city. I will say there's some things that I heard this afternoon from the consultant which kind of concerns me and encourages me. At the two previous meetings we had with the consultant, he very clearly stated to labor that if their research shows that the current proposal is not the best way to go, that they would make other recommendations and inform that of council. If you look at the report, item number 61, it says just the opposite. What it says is that they are considering only how to implement the current proposal. Again, if it isn't broke, you can't, and if it's broken and you haven't identified what's broken, what you're going to do is not going to fix it.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Michael Hunt, followed by Dominic Rubalcava. Good afternoon.
I'm here kind of on a selfish nature. I'm a general contractor who does work within the city of Los Angeles. I'm in February will be my 39th year, or my 30th year in business. I'm in my 29th year now. I've worked in a lot of different municipalities throughout Los Angeles and LA County, and LADBS really has done a fantastic job for us, and they're innovative. They adapt when there was a problem with the market. Their inspection services are great. The inspectors are some of the best in Southern California, and I deal with all of them. Plans that I can take into LADBS and pull permits over the counter. It takes me, 7 weeks in municipalities like Santa Monica or Beverly Hills in order to get the same permit done. The processes, the access to staff, the access to mid-managers, to supervisors is really good. And listening to some of the comments that were made here earlier, when they're talking about having building and safety taken over by city planning and development, it doesn't make sense to me. It makes it seem like it's going to make that department large and non-functional, like some of the. I'm sorry, I'm not used to public speaking, as you can tell.
You're doing great.
LADBS, they treat us as general contractors and management companies and so forth. They treat us like we're a customer. They don't treat us like, they treat us with respect. And I would just hate to, lose the asset that I feel that we have in being able to have that type of relationship with them.
Great. Thank you very much.
And in addition, one other thing is, I don't see. I also do a lot of estimating for my company, and of course not on the grand scale of what Matrix Company has proposed to do. But I don't know how in the world they're going to get budget numbers in front of you guys to see what the real fiscal cost is going to be. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you for your kind words. Mr. Rubalcava, followed by Fred Balderrama.
Good afternoon, council members. And to the new council members, my name is Dominic Rubalcava. Some of you may remember that I've had the opportunity to serve on 6 different commissions over a 25-year period, serving as a fire, harbor, Coliseum, water and power, transportation commissioner for 3 mayors. I know a lot about the city, I know a lot about public policy, and I know a lot about the difficulty that you have formulating public policy. I was a participant in one of the scoping meetings where the consultant matrix reached out to the community that's involved with these departments. We had architects, engineers, land use attorneys, permit expediters. We had a neighborhood council present. We had 20 individuals that were present. We went over a very detailed 2.5-hour discussion on this issue. Pluses and minuses of it, pluses and minuses of each of the departments, issues and problems encountered in all of the details that people had to deal with. At the end of the very, very end of the session, we took a vote, and the vote was real simple. Should we go forward with the consolidation? Are you in favor of it or are you against it? And it was 18-2 against the consolidation. People are very, very fearful that you're going to take a very well-run department, the Department of Building and Safety, and merge it with a department that is more deliberative, more ethereal, and less customer-friendly than the Department of Building and Safety. The issues that were raised had a lot to do with the way in which planning operates, what their assignments and what their duties are, and it's like mixing ketchup and mustard. You're going to create problems. If you go forward at the pace that you're going right now, I believe you're going to have a formula for disaster, and you're going to have a lot of problems on your hand. Councilman, can I have just one more moment?
One more point.
One more point. Having served on those commissions, I can tell you what it's like to be a city commissioner and what it takes to be a city commissioner. If you take a planning commission meeting that's 5 hours right now, and you consolidate it with a building and safety commission meeting that's 3 hours right now, and you have an 8-hour commission meeting, and you have board reports that are this high, I know what it was like to be on commissions when my fellow commissioners did not read their board reports. I know the questions I had to ask so they knew the information to make good decisions. I'm telling you, you're going to have a real headache and a lot of problems. The quality of your decision-making from your commissioners is going to go down, and you're going to have turnover and problems filling those assignments.
Well, we're going to be looking for experienced commissioners, Mr. Rubalcaba.
Some of us are retired.
All right, our next speaker is Fred Valderrama, followed by Jim McQuiston.
Honorable Chair, committee members, I'm Fred Valderrama. I'm a former city councilman for the city of Monterey Park for 13 years. On my 25th year as a economy and efficiency commissioner for the county of Los Angeles, initially appointed by Kenny Hahn and then Yvonne Burke, and recently with Riley Thomas. And I'm a land use and permit consultant. And in my line of work, I deal with planning department, building and safety, and different departments. And I think merging these departments is a very bad idea. There's a talk out there that LA City is very hard on businesses and not very business friendly. And I think a lot of the problem comes from the planning department. I have a client who I filed a variance for yard variance almost a year ago. And it's only for 2 feet variance for his backyard on his master bedroom. And the urgency is they worry about they have to tear down their master bedroom in their home, a home that they bought like 35 years ago, and they need a small variance. But it's been well over a year, and they pay their fees. I think it was close to $9,000, and they're still waiting for a hearing date. I have another case of a client of mine who wants to develop a tract with 5 homes, and everything was going smoothly until the planning department says I need a report about the blooming effect of a certain flower at the site. Well, it was summer, and this flower only blooms in the spring, so I had to wait 9 months to get this report, and we finally submitted this report. Why couldn't they accept that report at the same time? Anyway, I think the planning department has caused a lot of delays. A lot of people, they come to me to consult them. I say, well, this is what it'll take, this is how much it's going to cost, and they just walk away. And so I'm here to voice my objection to it. I think I heard very good comments. How can you make a decision today when you don't know what it's going to cost you? I think it's going to cost you a lot. As a commissioner for the County of Los Angeles, I've been asked many times to look into consolidation of different departments over 25 years. All my recommendations has always been fix the problem, streamline the problem, but don't join or dissolve these departments, make one big department. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Our next speaker is Jim McQuiston, followed by Dr. Rhodes.
Jim McQuiston, you know I've been a management consultant for too many years, since 1959, and been involved with the city in planning. I have to have an engineer's license to look at bonding, so I'm very, very familiar with the issues in this, and I've been trying to get especially the planning department to look at the laws and follow them. And that is really the major problem that I see in the city right now. I don't see a problem with building and safety other than they don't have enough people, but I've always had good luck and quick service out of building and safety. But planning is a big difficulty, and it shouldn't be. And if we stuck to what the state says we're supposed to be doing, we'd get a lot more happy developers. Besides, you have my statement. It's very succinct, and I'd certainly be glad to talk to your consultant. No one has asked me anything about this, but I have taken some pretty strong actions to try to get the city to follow the law, and I think the city is the best city in the world, but we do have a problem, and it involves corruption. We don't think of it as corruption. We think of it somewhere else, maybe Chicago. But we have it here, and we shouldn't be doing that. And we don't really want to do that, but we do have to think about the fact that building and safety is a police department. If we wanted to merge building and safety with the police department, that might be a good idea. But planning would never be merged with the police department. So I think that goes back to the drawing board.
Thank you. Our final speaker is Dr. Rhodes.
Hi. So I don't ordinarily like to testify if I'm not positive about facts, but I'm pretty sure SCIU probably was not involved in whatever discussion went on, and I just want to make sure that going forward we get looped in. Julie Butcher ran away to the desert on us to Riverside, and David Sanders was on vacation for most of July, so I'm pretty sure if there were meetings, we weren't there. And also, our coalition chair, Sister Parisi, has been out. She's coming back on a week from Monday, so I don't know that AFSCME was involved either. So I just wanted to hook up with the bus. Thanks.
Well, certainly labor was to have been included in the outreach effort by specific instruction of the council on this. So you might want to leave your card with Matrix, and I'm sure that that'll be followed up on. Thank you. Okay, so there's no need to take action on this. That was just an informational report, so we will note and file it. Thank you very much. I know a lot of people have been very concerned about where we stand on this, so I appreciate the update. That brings us now to item number 9.
Item number 9 is a joint City Administrative Officer, Department of Transportation, and Bureau of Engineering reports relative to recommendations regarding the project delivery method and summary project management plan for the LA streetcar project. This item was also referred to the Transportation Committee.
Okay. Before we hear the staff report, we do have a representative of Councilmember Weezar to offer comment. We'll do that as a courtesy to start off, and then we'll go to the staff report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
My pleasure.
My name is Jessica Wethington-McLean here on behalf of Council Member Jose Weezar. For those of you that have been around Council, whether as staff or as Council members for quite a while, you'll know that the downtown streetcar...
Sorry, excuse me. There's conversation in the room, and we can hear it up here. Dr. Rhodes, I'm sorry, we can hear the conversation up here, so please take it outside if you're going to have a conversation. Go ahead.
Thank you. The downtown LA streetcar is a huge priority for the council member. He's brought it from a great idea that a lot of people were talking about to something that's now almost in the middle of its environmental review, about to enter the federal process. The voters have voted on $62 million in bonds, and council has supported it with a 30-year operational plan. So we're really proud of his work thus far. We're proud of our collaboration with all of the departments that have embraced this. What we're here talking about today is the project management plan, which is sort of the structure for how do we do the public-private partnership that we've all been talking about. Los Angeles Streetcar Inc. is the nonprofit that was formed to help us put forward the streetcar. They were the proponent of the bond measure that was passed. And of course, LADOT is the owner of the project, and BOE will build the project. So now we're mixing all of that chocolate and peanut butter and coming up with a candy bar at the end. So that's really what this report is. Also in the report are some numbers that are sort of widely divergent in terms of how much the project is going to cost, which is really normal at this phase. We're about to enter the project development phase of the federal process, which is where we start refining all of the budget numbers. This meets by America, this doesn't. We can do it this way, not this way. A lot of the variance that you see is utility work. And right now, we just don't know how much utility work is going to cost. So the numbers that are in the report, because we do have to provide them to the federal government, we provided them here. We're not losing any sleep over these numbers at this point because we just really don't know. They represent a 100% perfect solution to 100% of what may or may not be a conflict, with streetcar providing 100% of the money to fix the problem, which is very unlikely to be the way that this goes. We've not had the opportunity to implement any engineering solutions to any of the conflicts. If we can move the rails 2 feet to one side or the other and avoid a $10 million conflict, then we would do that. That work hasn't even been undertaken at this point, that kind of engineering. So we haven't done any of the engineering solutions and a lot of the other technical things that we can do to bring the costs down. HDR did a quick pass, and even on their very first pass, reduced the numbers by 30%. So that's how variable these numbers are. And the council member has made it very clear that it is quite unlikely that the People's Project, which is the streetcar project, will give the Department of Water and Power a gift of replacing water pipes, which in some cases are more than 100 years old. Some of them date back to 1880. So the usable life of the infrastructure that would have to be moved has been gone for 100 years. So chances are streetcar, the People's Project, is not going to bear that cost, at least in full. So those conversations haven't even been had yet. Engineering solutions have not been sought. So these numbers are big, and they can be scary, but we're not losing any sleep over them for at least the next 9 months while we work out all of those solutions.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Jim Lefton with the Department of Transportation. With me is David Hirano from the CAO's office and Reza Shamzadi from the Bureau of Engineering. I'd like to start off by just clarifying that the intent would be for you to consider the September 5th, 2013 revised report. There was an earlier report dated August 26th. We added some additional information in the revised report regarding the potential economic benefits of the streetcar project. Do you hopefully have a copy of that report?
Members, do you both have the September 5th report?
And the previous one.
Okay, good.
As Jessica mentioned, the purpose of the report is to present a recommended project management plan for the project. That summary plan, which is recommended by CAO, DOT, and BOE, is included as attachment 1 to your report. Once approved by the council, this summary project management plan will be included in a letter that we plan to submit to the FTA by DOT, requesting that the FTA consider the project to enter the project development phase, which is the first step of a kind of a two-step process to get funding for the project. The approved summary project management plan will also serve as a framework to develop a much more thorough and comprehensive project management plan that will be used to detail how the project will be managed and delivered. This more detailed plan is required by the FTA before they recommend funding for the project. One of the key elements from the summary plan is the recommended project delivery method. After considering a number of different strategies, the three departments are recommending the construction manager general contractor method, or CMGC. This is the method that BOE is using currently for the 6th Street Viaduct project and allows for the construction firm and the city to provide input during the design phase, which will potentially reduce change orders and additional cost. It is also recommended that the city concurrently evaluate the feasibility of the design, build, operate, maintain project delivery method, or DBOM, including private financing opportunities. Another important consideration of the summary project management plan is the delineation of the roles and responsibilities of the city and the nonprofit Los Angeles Streetcar, Inc., or LASI. The summary plan that we put forward advocates a partnership approach in which the CAO, DOT, BOE, and LASI would all be voting members of a proposed executive committee to oversee and manage the project. The city will serve as the lead agency for the project, including design, construction, and operations. The city engineer will serve as the lead on all design and construction matters. DOT will serve as the lead on all matters associated with project operations, vehicle procurement, and FTA grant administration. The CAO will serve as the lead in administrating the special assessment tax funds and the overall project financing. As discussed earlier, the revised report includes information regarding the potential economic benefits of the streetcar project, as indicated in a 2011 study by the consultant AECOM, which was contracted by the CRA and LASI. An executive summary of that report is included as attachment 2 to this report. And as you can see, the AECOM report cites significant potential economic benefits to the city resulting from the streetcar project, including new development, creation of new businesses and jobs, and increased downtown tourism.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I don't want to break the flow of your report, but since you are presenting that as part of your report and including the AECOM executive summary attached to your report, why is it that we've had that report on the shelf now for 2.5 years and the CAO hasn't analyzed the assumptions that it's based on? As far as I know, no one outside of AECOM has made any analysis that any of the assumptions in it are reasonable in the slightest. Is that true or not true?
David Arano with the Office of the CAO. Generally, we don't analyze those for reasonable. Those are the opinions of a firm that was hired specifically for that purpose. We've been focusing more on the actual design and construction of the project itself. A lot of that is guesswork, and a lot of it bears a lot of assumptions into going through that. I'm not sure there's much value in us coming through and questioning some of those assumptions at this early standpoint in the game.
I'm fine with that. I just don't, I'm hesitant to make that a part of our discussion today, the economic benefits of it, when we really don't have anything to go on to discuss that because we haven't analyzed that. So what we're talking about is how we manage this project, not so much whether it's going to bear economic fruit at the end. Right?
We just wanted to include it as for informational purposes only.
I appreciate that. Okay, go ahead.
And finally, the report cites an updated cost estimate, as Jessica mentioned. For the last couple of years, the number that has been floated around by the CRA is about $125 million cost estimate. That's the number that was included in the CFD discussions. That's the number that was included in the department's report earlier this year to the council when the council ultimately recommended $294 million in operating funds from Measure R over the next 30 years for the project. The consultant that's working with Metro on the environmental, HDR, recently did a much more detailed and thorough cost estimate for the streetcar project. That new cost estimate ranges from approximately $232 million to $328 million. Assuming that the city were successful in receiving the maximum $75 million small starts grant allocation from the FTA, that would leave a projected funding shortfall for the project of about $95 million to $190 million. That range is pretty broad, but as Jessica mentioned, a lot of that has to do with the range in the utility costs. They range from about $79 million to almost $166 million. So utility costs are a large component of the overall cost estimate. I do want to point out this cost estimate is still preliminary and will continue to be reviewed and refined as part of the process, but it is the best information that we have at the moment. And I also want to point out that we're currently in the process of hiring a contracted project manager for the streetcar project, and one of the first tasks that we're going to conduct under that contract would be to do an independent cost estimate that we can compare to the HDR estimate, so we'll have a little more certainty about what the project's going to cost. That concludes my presentation. We're available to answer any questions.
Great. Can you talk a little bit about the Small Starts grant proposal? You know, what qualifies for that? What are the elements that disqualify a project for that? And what other, I guess, since we're moving forward on this application, what other sorts of things are on the city's priority list for Small Starts grants that might be excluded by moving forward on this?
In terms of the first part of your question, what's eligible for Small Starts, it's basically new fixed guideway capital projects or corridor-based bus rapid transit projects. The maximum cost for these projects is $250 million, roughly $50 million to $250 million in cost.
So, excuse me, if the cost overruns that are projected here, not cost overruns, if the estimated increased cost, including the utility costs here, were to exceed $250 million,
it would push us into the next level, which is the New Starts program. And all that funding, New Starts, Small Starts, and Very Small Starts, which are smaller projects, less than $50 million, all come from the same pot of money. So it's up to the FTA how they want to divvy up that money.
So if just thinking it through, if the grant is successful, if the application is successful, we get the maximum $75 million, and then the project goes beyond the $250 million, where does that leave us? Do we get to keep the $75 million?
We wouldn't get to that point. FTA wouldn't grant us the money unless we had all the money. We basically address the shortfall that we see today. They're not going to give us the money knowing that we have a shortfall on the local end. We can't.
I get that, but the shortfall is not the issue. The eligibility is the issue.
If we go beyond 250, we wouldn't be eligible.
We would no longer be eligible for the $75 million.
That's correct. We wouldn't be eligible for Small Starts. We would have to go after New Starts category funding, which is the higher level, more regional type projects.
Okay. So when does the grant fund? In other words, we apply for it, they say, great, it's a great project, we're going to move forward. When does the $75 million actually fund?
When does it fund?
When would it, if it's approved?
Well,
when in the process?
Yeah, the first step, in terms of the process, the first step is to get the letter in, which is to enter the first stage, which is a preliminary review of the project. It's called project development. Once you get into project development, they go through a review of the project in very general terms. The next step is to get into the second level, which is where they rate the project and determine whether they're going to recommend you for funding or not.
Okay.
At that point, you're going to have all the funding, all your ducks in a row, or they won't even recommend you for funding. We're under a really tight time frame. If we want to be considered as part of the 2014 budget, we really need to get the letter in quickly, and we need to get a request to have the project rated in the next month or so.
Okay. But here's where I'm going with this.
All right.
So all of this happens. It's approved. We're moving forward with the project development. All of the funding is in place. And then 2 years into construction, the new cost estimate is $350 million. Would we have received the $75 million in federal money by that point?
Yes, if we,
Okay.
once we,
So now the project has become ineligible
No,
for that money.
Councilmember, if I may?
Yes.
What you're looking for is the moment of what's called a full funding grant agreement. And when you reach the full FFGA, in FTA terms, you've all agreed on what the budget is going to be, where it's going to be allocated, what's going to be by America. At that point, when you are getting your full funding grant agreement, it's highly unlikely that you will exceed that past your contingency to the point that you would no longer be qualified for the program. You will have already agreed on your budget. Everyone will be set. There's, even in these numbers, very large contingencies. And the FTA has a very prescriptive process for how it determines budget eligibility. So that process, once you reach your FFGA level with, you have a fly there.
Yeah.
once you reach your FFGA, that scenario is, you've pretty much built in the insurance that isn't going to happen. That's what project development is really for, where you work out those kinks. And you say, we would like to do things this way, and FTA says, well, we want you to do them that way, and that affects the cost. And you work all that out during project development.
Okay. So that package is pretty much set. The project goes forward. If there are, we then have the federal commitment fixed at $75 million. We've committed what percentage of our Measure R funding for this?
For operations? Or there's no Measure R in the construction or design. It's the CFD, the special assessment tax, and the FTA grant, if we were to get that. That's the only, those are
the only two that go to the actual construction.
There are no city
Council member, though,
So then
it is
if there
important to
is
note-
construction overrun, where do we go then for that additional funding to make up the difference?
come back here.
Come back to the city.
Okay.
I just didn't understand
Mr.
the
Blumenthal.
answer. I don't mean to cut into
Yeah,
your
go
question.
right ahead.
Following up on it, the measure, you're saying that there's no Measure R local return funds that are being used in this?
No, there's Measure R local return dollars on the operational side. Funding for a streetcar is like a three-pronged stool. You have your local construction, your federal construction, and your operating funds, right? So the local construction dollars is a bond measure that was approved by voters in December for $62.5 million. The federal construction will come from the Small Starts program. If there are overruns, then we'll have to talk about it in the city, but at this point, without utilities, the budget for this project is 153 to 162. So it's the utility variable that we're trying to solve right now. And then your operating dollars are the non-construction dollars. That's the Measure R money. Council did about 2 years ago allocate $1 million of Measure R to help with the environmental on the project, but to my knowledge that hasn't yet been tapped. But that is in the project in the prep to help us get through the preliminary engineering and the environmental that's necessary.
Council members, David Arano from the CAO's office. There's approximately $300 million that the council did set aside for operations of the streetcar over the life of Measure R within the Measure R program. That is required, the council was required to do so in order to access the money from the CFD in order to maintain the commitment that would be made to the FTA for if we accepted funding. So the operation and maintenance of that streetcar is a requirement of moving forward. So
To make sure that you don't build something that you can't run.
well, you don't
Correct.
build it and just leave it sitting there. Yes,
Or
those
that
are-
you don't tax people for 30 years that a project that's only going to be operated for 5.
it's a promise
There was
made to
parity.
taxpayers, to the bondholders, and to the federal government that we would operate that for a minimum number of years.
Mr. De La Vega.
Jaime De La Vega, DOT. Maybe I can add some clarity and transparency on the issue. If the federal government approves the grant, the city is promising to build and operate the project as described. If there's any cost overrun, the mayor and council would have to commit additional funds at that time to complete the project.
So this is my concern, because right now we have 100, as my math, 137.5 million between the self-assessment and the full 75 million Small Starts grant. So looking at the report that I have in front of me right now, our current cost estimate is already in excess of that, even without utilities. It's already, the minimum estimate is 153 million. So the city right now, if we get that 75 million, is already on the hook for another almost $20 million.
Well, just to be
Am I
clear,
right about that?
Yeah, the city staff would not accept or ratify a grant without approval from the council and mayor. If we submit an application and we're recommended for funding by the federal government, we would return to the committee and the council and the mayor to accept that grant.
But my problem is this. We have so many bites at the apple in going to the federal government for federal transportation funding. If right now, as we're sitting here today, we don't have the money to do this project, or we don't know where we're going to get the money to do this project, and the request is to go and ask the federal government for $75 million for this project, presumably to the exclusion of other transportation priorities we have here, we still don't know how we're going to hold up the other end of that gap that we have right now. Before we talk about 1 square foot of utilities changes. So, And once we do that, then one of two things is going to happen. Either we're going to accept the money and be on the hook for whatever amount of money ends up coming in, or we're not going to accept the money, in which case we've lost the opportunity to fund $75 million worth of small starts in the city of Los Angeles.
That is correct.
Am I seeing that right?
That's correct, sir.
Councilmember, if I may, actually, technically correct. However, City of Los Angeles has no other small starts eligible projects. We have no other fixed rail. We have no bus rapid transit projects that would be eligible for small starts. So it's a little bit of a false choice. We're not competing against anyone in the City of Los Angeles for this funding. It's my understanding even Metro only has a few bus rapid transits that they might go through small starts with, but I don't think they have anything in that program now. So where you're technically correct, it's sort of an invisible competitor.
Well, that's actually the point that I was kind of getting to before, because as I sit here, I have no idea. I have no idea what's in the pipeline or might be. What's DOT's view of that?
Yeah, DOT does not have any fixed guideway projects in the pipeline other than the streetcar, which we're working on per council direction. Although, Mr. Krikorian and Ms. Bonin, in your capacity as Metro board members, there may be unfunded projects in the long-range transportation plan that Metro may want to submit to the federal government for funding. And those projects are within the city, but technically Metro projects, not city projects.
Mm-hmm. I see. Okay.
Would getting the train to the airport be one of those?
I believe the train to the airport is funded in Measure R and is included in the long-range transportation plan already.
Yeah, I think we're going to need more money. I'm going to ask Metro to come to committee on Wednesday when we would discuss this so we can get a little more light shed on that.
Great.
And is your feeling that the 75, that this would somehow make it more difficult to do those projects, or is there a cap on the amount of federal small starts we can get?
No, there is no cap from a financial or technical perspective. The issue is really one more of national politics, that typically each state does not get multiple projects when there are other projects in line from other states. And usually depending on who's in the leadership of the majority party, that can affect the allocation of funds on a year-to-year basis. So I know that's not a precise answer, but
are these competitive funds, or is this through the MAP 21?
Yes, they're discretionary funds. They're recommended by the Federal Transit Administration and then US DOT, but ultimately it's up to Congress to decide whether or not to fund projects. So we're sort of going through the administrative process right now, and there will also be a political process to, just like people lobby the council to appropriate funds, Congress also has to be convinced.
When is that up for reauthorization? That's a five-year bill, right?
Yeah, they're under a 2-year extension right now.
Yeah. So we're thinking that that's going to happen next year.
Yeah, I think the policy discussions are going to be happening the next 12 to 18 months.
And Councilmember, you had mentioned it doesn't even appear right now that we have enough money in the bank. So if we have a $15 million gap or a $20 million gap, what are we doing? Believe me, we're working on those solutions. We're not looking at council to fill this gap as with general funds. There are other competitive grants that the federal government puts out. One is a Tiger. One of the streetcar projects in, help me out, Tucson? Kansas City just got $25 million through the Tiger program. There's also an urban circulator grant. You can actually combine. You can commingle.
Usually the feds have strict rules about matching federal money with federal money.
No, there's been a few projects that have gotten small starts in Tiger. And there's also an urban circulator grant that a bunch of cities got a few years ago. So these grant opportunities do come. We're also looking at other alternatives that we can, put together on our side too. So we're in no way looking at council right now and saying we need general fund dollars. That'll be the last opportunity, the last thing that we pursue. Every other opportunity will be pursued before we get there.
And I very much, obviously, appreciate that. I guess my concern is moving forward on something, then whether we intend it or not, getting on the hook for it, and assuming that liability on our shoulders. I appreciate that, and I would hope, and I think I would actually insist that no other city funding, particularly general fund funding, be added to the construction of this, because we've gone very far, I think, on this project already with the Measure R commitment for operations, which is upon which everything else is contingent. What's our project cap for Measure R commitments typically, as a percentage of our total Measure R funding?
There is no cap.
Yeah, there's no cap.
It's approximately $2 billion of revenue over a 30-year period, and it's strictly a policy decision for the mayor and council how to allocate that within the confines of the Measure R ordinance. But basically, any transportation project or improvement is eligible.
Okay.
So, council member, if I may, we agree with you with some of the concerns you're expressing, and so one of the things that we see is critically important is getting that independent cost estimate done to give us another basis from which to make a judgment call as to whether we have sufficient funding for this project or not, and what the risk is to you as a council and to us as a city in moving forward with the project. And secondly, if you look at recommendation number 3 in the report, we also would like to have the opportunity to evaluate the design, build, operate, maintain model as we move forward, because that's a model that we view as a way of shifting a tremendous amount of risk in this project to an independent third party. So it's somewhat complicated, and it may be a little bit more complicated than our office is prepared to handle at this point. We would need some assistance from the outside, and that's what we're asking you to instruct us to do. But it is a model that Mr. Santana would like to explore specifically to potentially shift as much risk as possible away from us in accomplishing this project.
Is there any strong feeling on DOT's part about whether or not to proceed that way, to analyze both? Or?
I think the only reason we haven't made this the preferred alternative is because we haven't studied it enough to know whether it should be the preferred alternative. So we've agreed with them as to...
streetcars before, so we're sort of the guys in the forest with the machetes. We think it can work. We just aren't exactly sure how. So that's what the reluctance is. We can't say that we prefer to do it this way because it's never been done. So we fully agree that we should look at it. We think it's an excellent opportunity.
So how does this get resolved? I'm sorry, somebody needs to walk me through the step-by-step process from here out, because I heard we're on a tight time frame for the federal grant, and yet we're analyzing what kind of model to use here for project delivery. I'm not sure how we get that done, get the assessment of how to fund the gap, and then put together a grant application and then get that in a short time frame. Walk me through how that works.
It is complicated, particularly given the tight time frame that we're talking about. I mean, our direction from the council, again, based on the $125 million cost estimate, was to proceed with submitting an application, and that's the path that we're on today. The first step would be the letter with the council-approved project management plan summary, and then shortly thereafter, again, with the goal of trying to get into the 2014 budget, we would have to submit a request for them to rate the project and consider us for grant funding. With so many questions left unanswered in terms of the project delivery method, do we go with the CMGC or DBOM, with the open question we have regarding the shortfall on the funding that we have currently and the desire to do an independent cost estimate and how that's going to turn out. I mean, you have a couple of ways that we can go. We could just move forward with getting the stuff in and try to handle this on the fly, or we could do more analysis of the cost estimate and the project delivery method and then decide how and when we're going to proceed in going forward with the request for federal funding. But that could potentially cause us to get pushed another year in terms of the project.
If I may, it's actually, we've been advised by HDR, who's doing the environmental, who's actually very, very strong streetcar company in the United States, that it's not at all unusual to not have all these answers right now, that really is the purpose for the project development process that you get into. The DBOM or the DBOFMs, we've met for educational purposes with some that have done them in other parts of the world and other parts of the country, and it seems like they tend to take the projects on at about 30% engineering. So that's why we're in the process of hiring.
What does that mean?
You engineer your project in stages, and when you're at about 30% engineering is when the private sector considers the project developed enough enough that they can really analyze their risk, but not so developed that you've made decisions that they're not going to be able to change. Right now, we're at like 3%. So we need to get ourselves to 30% to even really have those conversations, and that's what you do during...
You need to get the grant process in place.
Exactly, and that's sort of what you do while you're in project development. So it seems a little kind of like we have a lot of unknowns, but really that's where you flesh it all out, is in the project development process with FTA, and as you get your project to a 30% or 30% engineering stage, that you could even, have these conversations with the private sector equity.
So
partner.
Can I correctly assume that once this grant application process starts with the FTA, that as this additional information is developed, then the grant application is supplemented with additional cost analysis and so forth before a federal decision gets made?
Yes.
Okay. So...
and before your final decision gets
made.
made.
You bet.
Yeah,
That goes, but our final decision comes at several stages here. I mean, it could come at any time during that grant application process, even after the grant, if in the event that the grant is in fact granted. If there is a positive outcome to the grant application and the federal government decides to fund $75 million, it comes back to the council, and the council decides accept it with all of the potential liabilities that come with it, or don't accept it.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
So we'll have multiple opportunities to weigh in on this throughout the course. Okay. Mr. Bonin, I'm going to turn it over to the transportation chair for a little while because I'm getting tired.
Thank you. And this is in Transportation Committee again on Wednesday, so I'll bring you a caffeine drink for Wednesday when we come back to it. So I'll save most of my questions for then, although I share the same concerns you have, Mr. Krikorian, not just about potential general fund impact, but for transportation funds as well. I mean, I'd much rather see transportation funds get people from one part of the city to another, or serve a neighborhood that doesn't have the same transportation opportunities that downtown does. So it really concerns me. I had a question about a couple questions about the numbers. We've talked about the utility prices might be inflated, that these are the worst case numbers. But the $75 million that we might get from the feds is the best case number. Do they either give us 75 or nothing, or can they give us 50? Could they give us 45? Could they give us...
They can give us anything up to 75.
Okay, so it could be less than 75. If we are awarded the grant of any amount, and then we have the situation that Mr. Krikorian just described, where we have to decide, are we going to take this risk because there is a potential risk to the city of some fund having to pay for it, whether it's the general fund, which we don't want to do, or the transportation funds, which I don't want to do. How does that affect our standing with the federal government when we apply for other grants? Do they look at Los Angeles with a little bit more of a jaundiced eye, or is it, let's move on?
They don't want to give you funding and then you don't deliver the project. So if we agree...
Jolted.
Yeah. If we agree to accept the grant funding, the expectation is that we're going to deliver the project. If the project goes over budget again, the expectation is that we're going to come up with the money to pay for it. And if we can't, it's going to impact the city's ability to not only get new grants, but get the funding for the grants they've already received funding for.
Mr. Dale,
yeah, just say based on my experience, it will also impact Metro's credibility if the city fails to deliver this project per a grant agreement.
Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Simply put, I think that various parts of the federal government look at Los Angeles sort of as a holistic organism, even though jurisdictionally we have lots of different parts. So I've been involved in situations where transit money was withheld because there was a dispute on airport issues. So, a lot of the stuff is interrelated. So if we're going to pursue this project, we need to make sure we can actually deliver it on the agreed upon budget.
So we wouldn't accept that grant funding from the Fed unless we were absolutely certain we could deliver the project. I mean, that's quite a bit down the road.
But I think the city staff that's at the table before you today, our point in this report is to disclose to the council, and this committee in particular, that there is a risk that there is not enough money currently committed to the project. We don't know that for a certainty. We're going to have to work through the better cost estimate that's identified in the report, but at this point in time, there is a risk.
You said you need to work through the cost estimate. When do you think that'll be done? When will we have a better sense of the risk?
The independent cost estimate that we talked about earlier, we are going to hopefully award a contract in October, and we expect that that would take about 2 months to complete that independent cost estimate.
And when do we expect to hear back on the $75 million?
Next year sometime?
I think the President would recommend it around January, February of next year, in terms of what he's recommending.
They reach a decision by January or February?
It's part. I think it would become part of the President's recommended budget, and then it's adopted. The official budget is adopted in October of next year.
I think the earliest we would know is January of 2014. Now, depending on the pace of the review by the Federal Transit Administration, it may or may not be part of the federal 2014 budget. We're trying to get it part of that budget, but that's not a guarantee.
So we have a fairly abbreviated time frame to make that decision, because if we want to avoid the situation that the money is granted and then we say no, further to Mr. Bonden's point about, relationships and all that, it's a fairly short time frame between now and January, basically, that we would have. Would there be a point along the line that we could still pull the plug on it before they reached a decision, for example?
I think you might have a little. I think I would reverse the order. They won't recommend us for funding if we don't plug the shortfall. So we won't have a situation where they recommend us and we turn it down. They just won't recommend us for funding until we figure out on our own.
So the process would be the independent cost analysis comes in. The council then sits down and decides, okay, there's some gap, or there isn't. But if there is, then we have to find some source for that before they would even consider the $75 million.
Right. And then on top of that, the FTA staff is typically very conservative in its cost estimating. So, a lot of the projects that Metro submits, for example, there's a back and forth, and frequently the construction costs are higher for the FTA staff as well as the operating costs, because they want to make sure there's a margin of error that locally the project will definitely be delivered and definitely operated. So even if the council is comfortable with the cost estimate from the various city agencies sitting at the table for both construction and operations, and we disclose all the underlying assumptions, there is the possibility that FTA staff would have a different view and cause us to revisit those calculations and come back to you again.
Well, and the other thing that worries me is, from sitting on the Exposition Construction Authority, I'd say a third of the items that are with us that are on our agenda are some utility issue we found that we didn't know about in advance when we were doing the budgeting. It's not the stuff that was anticipated that there was cost for, but the stuff that it's just not on our maps, and that's caused huge need to dip into contingency. So, some of the utility stuff could be higher, and then we'd be on the hook for that, right?
Well, actually, we're sort of purposefully going in a different direction than normal transit projects go for that reason. They make assumptions. We're actually doing the research. A utility coordinator is being brought on to actually dig into that issue specifically and make sure that we are right and we really do know, rather than making assumptions, because you can't. Metro does it a lot because they're dealing with billions. We're dealing with millions. And $1 million here or there, $10 million here or there makes a huge difference on a project this small. So we are sort of doing it in a little bit different way because it is sort of a micro project. So I have, a relative amount of confidence that once we work through these utility issues with the utility specialists, that we really are going to know those numbers.
Yeah, but a lot of the specialists don't know until you start digging.
Right. I'm sorry?
A lot of them don't know until you start digging
That's correct, especially in downtown. We see that over and over again, that every time we break ground, there are surprises.
Mm-hmm. I'll save anything for Q committee.
Mr. Blumenfield? So I think we've kind of beaten this to death, but just so that I'm clear on the commitment points that we have to make. Certainly no ground is broken on a project like this until all funding, including a significant contingency over the budget, is completely secured.
Correct.
Right?
Yes.
We're never going to get into a situation where we start digging up streets and then realize that we came up $30 million short. We got to go dig into the general fund for that, right?
Unless there are unanticipated things like something on the street that we didn't identify. But yes, you're correct.
Well, okay, so then
And
that's
Mark-
not right, is what you're saying. So in other words, once we're on the hook for it and we've accepted federal money, yeah, we're all in.
Yes.
Yeah, and
We're
you-
all in.
yes,
If
so
it
you-
ends up costing $500 million, we're all in.
Right, so you have market risk as well, right? Typically, in an economic cycle, there's projected price inflation over time. It's usually marked by the Consumer Price Index, but in some years in Los Angeles, construction prices have been flat. Other years, there have been double-digit increases on an annual basis. So, all of our assumptions are going to be based on a certain construction cost growth. If at the time we go to market to receive bids, the market is very high in price, you could also be on the hook there as well. Because until you get your bids, you don't know what the price is.
Okay, so again, the grant application is submitted when?
Given the tight schedule we talked about, we would have to submit the introductory letter for project development and a request to be considered for funding within the next month or so.
Okay, and does that introductory letter, at that stage, you have to have a preliminary cost estimate and explain how that
We'll give them the preliminary
is
cost
being done?
estimate in the first
Not yet,
letter.
not at that point.
It's literally a letter that talks about the project, gives them background information, and requests an entry into project development with all of the they'll get the same very divergent numbers as are in here, and they do not expect that we know how to
And then they
fill the
respond
gap.
to that letter presumably with requests for additional information and requests for a more thorough cost estimate and, other funding sources and so on. Okay,
It's a Mother May I game, and this is the first step of Mother May I.
okay. Well, members, I know it's going to be considered again in T committee, but for purposes of this committee's concerns, I would be comfortable with moving forward with staff's recommendations with regard to the project delivery methods. I think that this committee's report should appropriately include an instruction that before the city commits itself further to this project, that we have assurance that there is full funding for the project without any additional funding from city resources. And that would be my...
Will that come back to the Budget Committee for approval at that point? Or you're saying, or can we have it come back to the Budget Committee at that point so that...
Well, I think it necessarily would, because before they can move forward with with the expenditure of one more penny on this that comes from any city source, it would have to come here in any event. Is that right? Well, no, let me not ask whether that's right. That would be my expectation. So I think let's make sure that we have that commitment as part of this. If we're going to move forward in submitting an application to the federal government for federal funding, there has to be full funding proposed to meet the remainder of the obligations that the costs will entail. I think it's imperative that that full funding not include any further commitment of city resources. That's my point. And if there is some expectation of coming back for more city money, that would have to be something that would be subject
once
to
we
the...
sign the dotted line, then we're on the hook. Once we accept the federal money, even if we don't spend another dime of city money.
Before we accept long before they even grant the money, that would have to come back before this committee, because we have to approve the acceptance of a grant,
Yes.
correct?
Correct.
That would come before this committee, as well as T committee, as well as the council. Acceptance of the grant. Even before that, when the cost estimate is done, that will come before this committee as well, correct? So we'll hear a report back on that cost estimate and any proposal for any expenditure of city funds before the grant is even granted would have to come back before this committee as well. So but I think I feel pretty secure that we won't get to that point without further consideration by this committee. But it's going to be this committee's instruction that there will be no city money supplementing the assessment and the potential grant.
Councilmember, just one clarification, I think to your point. There already has been $1 million set aside, as we reported earlier, for the streetcar, so we would assume that your instruction means anything beyond that?
Remind me, I'm sorry. This
$1 million in Measure R.
It's already in the budget.
Yeah, it's already been appropriated.
Yeah, it's
so.
already in the budget. It's already been appropriated.
Okay.
I just mean, I don't want to go down the trail of continuing to have to, hit the moving target.
Understood. I just didn't want you to be surprised.
I appreciate that.
Later.
Thank
okay,
you.
thank you.
Anything further, Mr. Bonin?
No.
Okay with that, Mr. Bonin?
Yeah. You talked about the cost of, I was out of the room for a little while, so I apologize. You talked about the cost of financial advisors and that kind of thing, and what those are in this. Did you guys cover that?
Yeah, actually, where does the money for those services come from? Where does the seed money come
Well,
from?
that's
$1 million?
a good question. We haven't actually worked out the costs on that yet. We're going to have to do that and get back to you on that.
Well, but
I can give a different answer,
on the financial
Mr. Chair.
advisor.
The LASI, which is the nonprofit that we're partnering with, they are the grant recipient for dollars from CRA in the state. They currently have about 6 or 5.2, I think, of the 10 million that they were granted. So we are actually spending their money right now on the project manager that's being hired, on the utility specialist that's being hired. So we've been very careful that the city is not actually funding these things, and that's where this money is coming from. When we talk about getting to 30% engineering, we're spending the nonprofit's money to do that.
The nonprofit's money, meaning the CRA money?
The CRA money that's been granted to the nonprofit for the project.
Just tax money.
Right, but it's not dollars that are granted to the city. The city is not the grant recipient, the nonprofit is. So that's why the partnership is important too, because they brought to the table not only the CFD that got us the bonds, but they also bring us the ability to even get to the point where we know what our budget will be. Because we don't, as a city, have the money allocated to do the engineering and the utility work necessary to even figure out what this project will cost. So we are spending the money that was allocated from CRA to the nonprofit to get us to that point.
But to answer your question directly, we do not know how much it will cost us to hire a financial advisor to advise us on the design, build, operate, maintain model. We will have to get back to you on that, and we'll need to talk to our bench of advisors to figure that out. So the funding sources, it could be as Jessica described, but in terms of the exact amount, we don't know yet.
Well, I mean, maybe we can get an order of magnitude, because if there's $5 million or so that's there in the nonprofit, and the financial advice ends up costing $15 million, then what is the source of the seed money for that extra money?
Understood. I don't think it'll be that much, but we will definitely get you a number.
But do we have certainty that it's going to be able to be achieved within the money that they have now?
Well, I think our first strategy would be to gain some sense that this can actually be done, and it can be done in an effective manner. Now, CD14 has brought to us some experts who claim that it can, but I think we'd like to independently verify that, and that can be done for a lot less than $15 million. So,
I'm sorry.
Also to be clear,
let me, because I think in simple terms.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
And I know it's hard to apply simple terms to complicated transactions, but what we're talking about approving here with your recommendations is doing some of that analysis, getting the financial consultants to do all of that stuff. Right now, our funding sources are a grant that we have not yet applied for, and the assessment, which has not yet begun, and $1 million that's already in the budget, and $5 million or so that's in CRA money that's in the nonprofit.
Correct.
So do we know with certainty, as we sit here, that what we're approving today can be paid for with the money that is currently in the bank appropriated to be spent either by the city within the $1 million or within the nonprofit's money?
We
And
think
if we
that-
don't, then where is that money going to come from?
We think that at least an initial assessment can be paid for with that money. And if we're wrong and we feel that there's an appropriation needed, we would obviously be back here talking to you about that.
Okay, so nothing's going to be spent outside of those sources, again, without coming back here.
And just to be clear, I think you're aware, Mr. Hirano, the CRA dollars are specifically allocated for environmental and preliminary engineering. So I actually don't think looking into the DBOFM would be an eligible expense, so they wouldn't get that from the state. So we would have to look to either the Measure R million or internal accounting to figure that out. Because they wouldn't, that wasn't anticipated when they drew up the contract with the state.
So the financial advisors are not included in the CRA money.
Correct. It's specifically for environmental and engineering.
Sort of my next question is, we obviously don't have carte blanche to spend the nonprofit's
Correct.
money. There's got to be some restrictions on that.
There are. It's very specific.
And it sounds like some of the, the consultants and design folks, they don't fall within the realm of what can be spent by the CRA money.
I think for environmental and engineering, which is getting us to the point where we understand utilities and those kinds of things, that all falls within the scope of work. Analyzing an alternative funding mechanism for the project would likely be out of scope.
I will add that
For that money.
for that $5 million that we talked about in the CRA money, we're looking to use that money to fund the project manager that I mentioned earlier that we're looking to hire. So we're in the process now of looking at how much money is available and what restrictions there are on that money to see how far we can go with the project manager. This is an additional expense with the DBOM financial analysis, and we'll have to figure out how we're going to pay for that. As Jessica said, it may not be eligible under the funding from the CRA.
And so if it's not eligible, where does it come from?
It would either come from the Measure R money, or we'd have to come back here and have a discussion with you as to whether you saw fit to make an appropriation to pursue that.
The Measure R money that's already been...
Yes, correct.
Because there's no new
Correct.
Measure R money that's part of it.
Yes.
Okay, so but the recommendations that are before us today, that we have to approve today, we're not going to include any appropriation of additional funds, obviously, and really, it's to authorize the RFP. An RFP will go out, bids will come back, proposals will come back.
Right.
If those proposals exceed what we have to spend, then we make that decision then, right?
Right.
I mean,
Right.
So nobody's going to go out and start spending money on this until the proposals come back, and the proposals will have to be considered by this committee if they exceed the $1 million, right?
Correct.
Okay.
And maybe when it all comes back, we get a sort of a nice neat chart to make it easier for us to understand where pots of money are coming from.
Yeah.
Here.
It's taken me 7 years, so yeah,
that
I
would
hear
be
you.
Maybe some-
And when we have that discussion, I'd like food and water provided.
Yeah.
Me too.
Bread and water. Okay, so we have a few cards on this matter, which actually just 2 cards. We have Steve Needleman and Eric Metz.
Mr. Needleman already,
Oh, did he? Okay, thank you.
he's the chairman of the board from LA.
Sorry for the delay. We had a lot of weighty matters on the agenda today. Mr. Metz.
It's Eric Metz from LA Streetcar, the product director. I don't want to belabor the conversation at all, but there's sort of 2 big things we want to talk about. Is one, the engineering costs today to really prepare with not enough analysis. So the range we're seeing, as the folks mentioned, is very large. LA Streetcar Inc. is spending its own money right now to hire a utility specialist to get into the details of that work and understand with a better level of sophistication where the costs are coming out. I think to Mr. Bonden's point about Metro's costs, one distinction here, though, that the city has in its favor is that the city holds the franchise agreements, whereas Metro doesn't. For those costs that Metro just pays because they have to, the city won't have to pay all those in this instance. So there's some flexibility there that's not fully recognized. The other big point we wanted to focus on, too, is that the method of delivery, the CMGC method, is very advantageous for a lot of reasons, primarily because it lets the city gain a better sense of where costs are coming as a product develops. So you have a stronger ability to control those utility issues, control design issues as you're going, rather than just trying to build one massive project. There will also be a very detailed risk assessment done on the project before you even enter the small starts process. Formally, you're really, really well into it. Because the FTA wants level of assurance that you guys want as well, that you're not signing up for a larger product than you can possibly bite off. So there's several places and avenues by which you get a check and a balance on all the different metrics out there to make sure the city's getting the project it thinks it's getting. The feds also agree with that analysis. So those are very quick comments.
Well, just a quick question, because again, not to belabor the point, but what I heard was that this grant decision is made 4 months from today. So we don't have a lot of time to do that kind of detailed risk assessment analysis before that decision is made. That's what, I guess, the part that I'm still struggling to understand a little.
There's several steps that happen concurrently. There's not a final decision that gets made in January, February, but the process between now and then, it's about rooting out where you are and understanding where you're going to fit into the federal fiscal years. There's a chance you may not make this fiscal year, but you may make next fiscal year. You'd much rather submit now, get in line, get all the documents out there, be well known by all the FTA staff, and start that conversation with them so that the next fiscal year you're already ready to go. You have even more information. So there's a huge plus to doing it now, which is waiting another full year to do that.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Have no other cards, so if there's no objection, we'll proceed as I outlined earlier, and that will be the action of the committee without objection.
And for clarification, that were the recommendations in the report dated September 5th?
Yes.
From the joint. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And I guess there being no... Oh, no, we do have one more matter, don't we?
We have item number 13. That's the City Administrative Officer report relative to requests for increased funding for attorney conflicts panel contracts with the law firms of Atkinson, Andelson, Loya, Rood, and Romo, Haight Brown and Bonesteel, LLP, Harrell, Cantrell, LLP, and Mayors Nave, Ribeck, Silva, and Wilson.
I am so sorry. I really should have taken you out of order. or this is, members, borderline a consent matter, but I think there were a few changes that we had to make in the report.
Right, and I have some changes too, so it's okay, it works out. Okay. I'm Dolores Rivera of the CEO's office, and I oversee the Attorney Conflicts Panel, and this is your first introduction to the Attorney Conflicts Panel, so I'll give you a quick. The purpose of the Attorney Conflicts Panel is when there is a conflict of interest matter that precludes the City Attorney's Office from handling, that portion of the case is referred over to the City CAO's office for handling or for retention of outside counsel to handle that conflict. And the conflict can be an entire, the entire assignment, or it can be a partial where that would be representation of one or two individuals. So with that, the CEO is requesting funding to amend 5 contracts, 3 of which are labor cases. They are 100% conflict cases, so therefore the spending, the cases are more complex, more involved, and therefore the spending is a bit higher. The other 2 cases are police litigation cases, and those are partial. They are complex as well, but not as involved, and so therefore the funding is not as great. The labor cases involve, the 2 with Atkinson and Andelson are dealing with the issues of furlough and the early retirement, and the one with Myers Nave relates to the retiree health benefits. Haight Brown is an appeal case, and the other one with Garrett, the Garrett case with Harrell, is also a police litigation case, and that one is going through the discovery phase right now. And so with that, I did have an amendment to make on my request, and that is to reduce the funding on page 2. The initial request was $400,000. I wish to reduce that down to $300,000.
I'm sorry, for which one?
On page 2, number A, and that would be for
Oh, okay.
$400,000. I wish to reduce that to $300,000. B, that request was initially $300,000. I wish to reduce that to $200,000. And the basis for that is because after preparing this, I did look at the fund itself, and the other contracts that are in the works, and I need to slow down the spending.
Great. And I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Just, some of these jumps are very significant.
Yes.
Why do
Because-
we have a current contract amount that significantly underestimates the amount that we're, for example, with Atkinson?
Okay.
You know, we're quadrupling that. Why is that?
Because those are complete conflict cases. So when I look at that, I'm looking at when I'm making that assessment, I'm looking at the volatility of the case, where it's at. It's right now in the early stages. There's a lot of, they're in the discovery stages, and there's a lot of hostility, so there's going to be a lot of spending with the discovery, the depositions, the motions, and so, and then in addition, I'm also looking to reduce the number of times that I have to come up to request funding. So I'm funding those amounts a bit, more so than the partial assignments. Again, complete conflict cases, there's more responsibility, and so I'm factoring that in.
It's not that the amount is unreasonable at all. It's just the jump.
The jump. That's the reason, is because I'm up-funding the cost now. But subsequent to this, I've looked back at the fund, and I need to pull that down.
Well, thank you for the changes. Mr. Blumenfield?
Yeah, so you could come back again several more times theoretically.
Oh, yes.
So it's not like this is the amount that's going to be needed to settle the case,
Right.
necessarily. This is just the amount to get us through
Discovery.
discovery.
And this is attorney's fees only. It has nothing to do with what we're reserving for a potential judgment or settlement.
Right.
Payments to the law firms.
Right. Settlements are paid, judgments and settlements are paid out of a different pot of money, liability claims account.
So the timing in terms of, so a case like this is probably going to cost a heck of a lot more than
It could.
$300,000.
It could, but, litigation is also active, and so it can quickly
It could settle and theoretically be less.
go away.
Or go
Right.
Right.
But because,
Chances are these are going to grow.
right, because of the hostility, the volatility, let me use that word instead, the volatility with what's going on with these cases. Yes.
And obviously you're doing some sort of checks to make sure that the incentive is to be effective and efficient as opposed to.
Right, right.
I assume that there's a process for choosing these firms and that there's
Yes.
quality control on it so that they're not just getting a blank check here.
Yes, yes. The attorney conflicts panel consists of a panel of pre-established or pre-selected law firms for various categories. So all these firms have been pre-selected through an RFP process that was done last year. And so therefore also the rates are also predetermined during that process.
Are all of these paid on an hourly basis?
Yes.
And we, as I recall on the conflicts panel, have an hourly rate cap.
Right.
So-
Right. We have a two-tier. It's a complex and a non-complex rate compensation based on the complexity and involvement of the assignment.
And there's,
And it's also based on category. For example, an employment case, an employment labor case would command higher rates than, say, for example, a tort case.
and so you are the person who's sitting and reviewing their bills and determining whether or not there's churning going on, whether there's excess work, make work.
Right. I can tell that. I can tell that, definitely. And then also in addition with the status reports. But the billing serves as a diary. I can tell I can tell how active the case is based on that, and I can also catch duplication of costs and so forth.
Okay. Anything further, members? Okay. It's within the amount that's already budgeted. It doesn't have any
Yes.
impact, so it'll be the action of the committee to approve the recommendations as amended, and thank you for the amendments. And that bringing us to the end of our business.
Yes.
We are.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.